So my dad is from Kentucky, and that's where most of his family still lives. But we moved to Ohio before I was even born, and that's where we currently live. We used to visit his family a few times a year since as far back as I can even remember. I say used to because I haven't gone in almost 10 years. I'm 25 now. The long rides to Kentucky were always so boring. I had a Sony Walkman that I would try to listen to on the way, but my dad's hillbilly singing overpowered even the highest volume on the damn thing, so most of the trip was as horrible as you can imagine. The one thing I always looked forward to was getting to hang out with my cousin Jay. He was exactly 1 year younger than me, literally born on the same day. He was just as easy to get along with. There was never that awkward, "Hey, how have you been?" moment where you have to adjust being around someone again. We always picked up right where we left off, no matter how long it had been. Once we made it into Kentucky, we would always meet at our grandparents' house. Most of the family would already be there waiting for us when they knew we were coming. I always remember everything happening pretty much the same way every time, at least on the first day. We would usually stay the whole weekend, and that Friday we would spend the night at our grandparents'. All the parents would stay up late in the kitchen, drinking and playing cards. The younger kids would sit in the living room and watch cartoons with Grandma. Me and Jay, and our other younger cousin Robbie, stayed in the back room. I guess it could have been considered a second living room, but we always just called it the back room. We would always try to stay up late and watch scary movies. I don't know why, but it seemed like we ended up watching the same movie every time. I don't remember the name, but I clearly remember one certain scene. Some monk-looking guy's in a jail cell, and he ends up squeezing his head between the bars. I can't tell you why that scene sticks out more than the others. It's not like it terrified me or anything. Anyways, moving on. Saturdays were always up in the air. Sometimes we'd visit other family members, other times we would go shopping at the malls and stores. This particular Saturday was different than the usual. All of the adults decided they wanted to go gamble, so our grandma agreed to stay and watch over us for the day. The only people left in the house were me, Jay, Robbie, Grandma, and Great-Grandma. There's a reason why I haven't brought my Great-Grandma up yet. That's because I honestly didn't know much about her. What I did know was enough to make me not want to know. She was very sick, and she had been for many years. At a younger age, I guess I was just too scared to ask what was wrong. I only remember the times when family members would rush into her room when she needed something. She was too weak to get out of bed, so the god-awful zombie-like moans is what got everybody's attention. Her room was right down the hall from the living room, the first door on the right. She never left that room, and unless she needed attended to, nobody went in there. At least that's what it seemed like. As if she was a caged monster being kept quarantined from the rest of the family. And from some of the stories I would overhear, I could understand something wasn't right. Stories of how her room would drop in temperature out of nowhere, or how her bed would shake uncontrollably. Sometimes she would talk to herself in a language that no one else could understand. Once again, hearing all this at a young age, of course, I thought it was terrifying, but I never put much more thought into it. Anyways, back to that Saturday. All the adults had just left to go do whatever. Me, Jay, and Robbie were in the living room playing the Sega. Our grandma said she needed to get some laundry done and went down into the basement. I can't recall what game we were playing, but I remember it was only 2-player, so one of us always had to wait for our turn. While I was on the couch waiting for my turn, I saw something out of the corner of my eye. I looked down the hall and noticed our great-grandma's door was cracked open a bit. I quickly looked back at the TV, trying to ignore all reasons on why her door would be opened, even just a little. Then, something else caught my eye, and almost as if I was being forced to, I looked. Through the crack in the door, I could see her, just standing there, hunched over a bit and staring at me. The fact that I've never locked eyes with her before was probably what scared me the most. I slowly turned back towards Jay and Robbie, who could definitely tell that my mood had changed. Robbie asked what was wrong, and all I could say was, "She's looking at us." Right away, they both jumped to their feet and peeked their heads around the corner. Then Robbie blurted out, "She probably needs help," as he started to rush out of the room toward the basement. Jay and I stood there in silence, not really sure what to do. We tried to ease the tension by joking with each other, but that was cut short when we heard her door slowly creak open a bit more. Then she slid her old, bony hand through the crack and motioned for me to come toward the room. To this day, I honestly don't know why I didn't just wait. I guess I felt like if I didn't go, and something bad happened, it would be my fault somehow. So, I nervously made my way into the hallway and right outside her door. I could feel my heart beating faster. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely move them. I looked back at Jay, and he was giving me this look, like he should have just said goodbye to me while he still had the chance. Then, her door opened slowly, but all the way. She was still hunched over, clinging to the wall, and looking up at me. It was the first time I had ever been this close to her, so I was not prepared for what I saw. She had whitish gray hair that was long in some spots and shorter in other spots, but completely bald in a lot of other spots. Her skin was wrinkled, but looked almost as if it was melting together. She had color in one eye, and the other was completely white. I don't know how well it was hiding it, but I was horrified. If the sight wasn't bad enough, she was also making these deep scratch-like noises every time she took a breath. Then she started mumbling something softly. I couldn't hear, so I tilt my head down closer to her and try to hear her better. The deep breathing stopped, and I heard what sounded like a raspy laughter coming from her. Confused, I pulled my head back only to see her stone-faced evil stare right at me. For a second, I swear there was a yellow tint in her colored eye. Her mouth moved. It was definitely her talking, but it didn't sound like it was coming from her body. It was deep and sinister, and sounded like it was coming from the ceiling. "Get the hell out of my house." I will never forget those words. I turned around and saw Jay in the hall, who clearly heard what I did. His mouth was wide open, and he looked like fear just slapped the hell out of him. At the same time, our grandma came rushing through the kitchen and right past me into the room. Jay, Robbie, and I sat in the living room as we heard Grandma shut the door, and the room went silent. It must have been a good 10 minutes before our grandma came back out and sat down in the living room with us. I was the one to break the silence by telling her what had just happened. She became emotional as she went on to tell us everything that had happened to my great-grandma, how she only became ill after this house was bought. I guess great-grandma warned Grandma about the house. Apparently when the house was for sale, and they were looking at it, great-grandma heard the voice of who she said was Satan, and he told her to get out of the house. So she tried everything she could to turn Grandma away from buying the house, but in the end, she bought it anyway. Then great-grandma became very sick and had to move in, knowing it was seemingly cursed. She blamed this house for her sickness every day, but Grandma said she was just losing her mind, until the not-so-normal stuff started happening. Grandma didn't seem like someone who would make something up to try and scare us, especially if it was about her own mother. It made me think if that's why things were the way they always were, why nobody ever went into her room, and why she never came out to see anybody. It was also a lot to take in, and most of it I didn't really understand yet. So I asked her why great-grandma would tell me to get out. What did I do? Grandma looked at me with the most serious look she has ever given to me and said, "What you heard in there wasn't her. I've heard it too. It's something else." The look in her eyes, the tone in her voice, I'll never forget her telling me that. Even to this day, when I think back, I can clearly hear her voice as if it was for the first time. After leaving that weekend, we found out about halfway through the week that great-grandma had passed away. Although I wasn't close to her, it hit me in a very different way, a dark way. I felt as if it wasn't just old age or her sickness, but something a lot more insidious. First, some backstory. Growing up, my parents would foster children. We had a group of kids living with us, and I became good friends at the time with one that was around my age. I don't feel right using his real name, so for now, I'll just call him Bud. Eventually, Bud was taken back to his family, and as time went on, we lost contact. Now for the story. Early 2008, I had turned 18 and decided I wanted to switch schools and move out of the same town I had been in forever. I was staying with a cousin in Rapid City, South Dakota. I had gotten word that Bud had committed suicide. I felt terrible after hearing this. I was in the basement of my cousin's aunt's house doing laundry and thinking about everything that has happened, but mostly about Bud and how terrible I felt that I wasn't there to talk to him and to be a better friend. I never felt right in the basement there. You never quite felt alone. As I was thinking things over, I got mad. Mad at the idea that he would do something, like that, mad at myself, mad at the world at the time. I picked up some of my laundry, and in a rage, I threw it across the room. I went upstairs and started watching TV with my cousin, his friends, and his aunt, who we should call Carrie. Ever since I left the basement, I felt uneasy, and Carrie could see that I was not acting my usual self, and she asked me what was wrong. I said nothing and we all continued to watch TV, until my cousins and his friend decided to go hang out in the back room. She asked me once again what was wrong, so I started to tell her. I told her about what had happened with Bud, and who he was, and how I cared for him like family. I felt even more uncomfortable as I went on telling what had happened. All the while, she sat there listening and understanding. All the while, I feel this intense feeling of being watched. I start to cry as I tell her I feel almost responsible for him committing suicide, because I wasn't there for him as a friend or as a family member. The feeling of being watched is almost to the point of unbearable as I dry my eyes. I ask her, "Do you ever get the feeling that you're being watched?" As her face of understanding and sorrow changed to fear, the hair on the back of my neck stand up and she yells, "Where?" I, in almost shock at her reaction, point toward the kitchen from where I felt the stare. She looks in the direction I'm pointing in, and just as soon as she looked, and in the best way I could describe it, all hell breaks loose. Dishes start flying, smashing into walls, as if someone was in a furious rage. Doors in the cupboard flew open, and you could hear breaking glass. I feel fear. As I look at Carrie, she calmly goes to a shelf, she grabs a box off the shelf and opens it, pulls out dried sage and a lighter, and begins to fill the room with smoke from the plant. She walks toward the kitchen, and everything starts to stop. She keeps walking through the house, and opens the basement door, and almost seems to usher something back down the stairs. She comes back into the room and asks me, "Are you okay?" I say, what the hell just happened? I assume my face had to be pale from the event that had just taken place. She informed me that whatever is living in the basement, she said it was a demon, and she's had to deal with it before. She tells me one of her own foster kids that she had taken in had an experience where the kid was attacked by this demon. This boy I met, he weighed maybe 95 pounds, super skinny, and when it attacked him, it took 4 people to hold him down so they could perform some sort of exorcism on him. Apparently, when I was in the basement and threw the laundry, this thing took notice that I was in a vulnerable state and was trying to attach itself to me. I don't know how to end this story, so I'll just end it with this. Please, everyone, anyone, be careful out there, and don't take the people you love for granted, and I'm glad I wasn't alone in this situation. My story may not be as interesting as a lot of other people's stories, but it's important to me, and honestly, it's an event that changed my life. Probably even saved it. For some backstory, when I was 23, I married the love of my life, and honestly thought that my life was set. She was the one person that had always been there with me through all of my hardships. She lifted me up when I was down, and she encouraged me to live my dreams of being a financial advisor. I know, not the most exciting dream job. I enrolled in classes to actually start down the path of being a financial advisor, a lot of really boring math classes and classes about investing, etc. I got a job as a teller at a bank. It was easy and the hours worked out for my classes. Through all this, she always pushed me to keep going. She knew it was what I wanted to do for a living, and she's always encouraged it. I worked my ass off for our future, and I pretty much put in all the time I could physically manage. Because of this, I was always mentally drained between working with people all day and doing classwork all night. I was never really up to doing anything. Then, one night in July, I had gotten home late and was, as stated, absolutely exhausted. When I got home, I fell onto the couch and basically passed out. About an hour or so, she woke me from my afternoon nap and asked me if I wanted her to get something for us to eat, since she hadn't had the chance to make dinner and I clearly wasn't going to. I told her that was fine and that I could go for Taco Bell. She agreed, told me she loved me, gave me a quick kiss, and said she'd be back in 20 minutes. I smiled and shut my eyes again. I dozed off for a few minutes, and when I woke up, I looked at my watch. It had been around 40 minutes since she left. I was confused, but not overly concerned. Maybe traffic had been bad, maybe there was construction somewhere along the way. I pulled out my phone and called her, but she didn't answer. Again, I thought maybe she was driving and just didn't want to be on her phone, so I thought nothing of it. I got up from the couch, went to the restroom, did a few other things to occupy about 10 or 15 minutes, then I called her again. This time someone answered, but it wasn't my wife. Honestly, a lot of details are a bit foggy, and I'm not going to get into all the details, but I remember being told that she had been in an accident, and I remember pretty much just being told that she died on impact. Apparently, some drunk driver had run the red light while she was leaving the Taco Bell and T-boned the driver's side. He lived, albeit with some fairly severe injuries, but she was gone. This obviously was the most devastating thing that had ever happened to me. I was able to take some time off work, and I managed to get some time off school because of what had happened. But no amount of time off is ever enough to help when you lose someone like this. I remember sitting at home and just staring at the ceiling one night, thinking about how unfair it was that the guy that killed her got to live, and I just remember crying in rage. That was the night that I started drinking heavily, and the first night that I'd ever blacked out. It's almost ironic. A drunk driver is the reason she died, yet I turned to drinking to drown out my problems. I did this on and off for a month or two. I ended up not going back to class, and ended up losing my job because I missed too many days of work from being hungover. I pretty much just paid the rent and the necessary bills to keep my home, and slept all day after that. This went on for a couple weeks, blacking out, waking up, lying in bed staring at the ceiling, getting drunk, rinse, repeat. Then, after about 2 weeks of this, I woke up from one of my drunken stupors to what I thought was someone shaking me. I remember feeling like someone had put their hand on me and pushed me, but when I jumped up, there was no one there. After my mini panic attack, I laid back on the bed and closed my eyes, and that's when I heard her voice. I remember distinctly that I heard my wife's voice telling me that I needed to stop before I killed myself. It was honestly as clear as the last night that I saw her, when I heard it. I felt like my heart had stopped and my stomach muscles tensed. She didn't say anything more, and she didn't have to. I knew right then and there that I was ruining everything that we had ever tried to build, and that she wouldn't have wanted that for me. That was the last night that I drank, the last night that I wallowed in self-pity. It was just the last night that I did all of that. I woke up and made a promise to myself and to her that I was going to turn my life around. From that moment on, I was going to live the best life I could for her. There's not a super happy ending to this story, unfortunately. It's been about 2 years now, and I've been sober since. It wasn't easy to stop drinking, and it wasn't easy to force myself to keep going, but I did it for her. That night, I believe that she saw what I was doing to myself, and she saw where I was going to end up, so she came to me one last time to get me to stop. I never went back to school, which was probably a dumb thing to do, but I'm back to working at a bank, and I'm happy with where I am. If she hadn't come to me that night, I probably would have ended up drinking myself to death. When I was 19, my friends and I met this woman walking in our neighborhood at like 2 in the morning. She was probably about 32, she said she was 26, and was really, really beautiful. We were on our skateboards, and she asked if she could ride one with us. So of course, my friend and I, being the typical teenage skaters, were trying to impress her, and she caught on to a connection with me really quick. Her and I started walking down the street while my friends got distracted. We were just talking BS and trading stories. But after a while, I started getting this very dark vibe from her. Like a switch in my intuition just flicked. And I've always been good at reading people, but at that age, I had a strong bit of naivety in my veins, especially when looking at a beautiful older woman. But nonetheless, the dark vibe really started consuming me, and the more I looked into her eyes, the more I noticed there was something odd about her, but in a very bad way. I suggested we go back to my friends, and as I turned around, she stopped me by pulling on my arm. She was a very small woman, and I've never been a very small guy, but her jerking on my arm felt like it was a grown man's. I asked her what the problem was, and she just kind of looked up, as if to think of an excuse, and chalked it up to nothing, sorry. So we went back to my friends, and I pulled a chance to talk to my best friend in private and told him what happened. He, of course, always had the typical teenage boy mindset, and read into it as if the woman was actually trying to get me alone to sleep with me. And his confidence started to appeal to my wishful side and turned my worry away. So we went on a skating adventure with her up Main Street a few blocks, and she stopped us and asked us if we could help her with the favor. I asked what the favor was, and she said her ex-boyfriend's house is close to where we were at, and that she just wanted to stop by and grab some stuff she left there. I thought it sounded pretty reasonable, the way she was explaining it all. She said her ex-boyfriend and her had a baby that didn't make it, and after it passed, they constantly fought until their separation. She told me he'd be fine with her stopping by, and assured us that all was well. Well, we show up at the house, and, mind you, I'd lived in that neighborhood for close to 5 years, and skated and ran those blocks constantly. So, I was fairly familiar with the houses and the environment. We pulled up to this large old house that my friends and I had known for some time that nobody lived there, and hadn't before I even moved into the neighborhood. She stopped and said, "This is it, can you come in with me?" My best friend gave me eyes, telling me that he now knew what I was talking about, and so I diverged from him and walked up to her. I told her that I think she had the wrong house, and that I've known this house to be vacant for the last 5 odd years. She kept coming up with any excuse to go into the house, even past my friend chiming in to validate my story. Finally, I asked her what I should have asked her all along, which was what she was needing from the house. That's when I had her. She got caught in her lies and had no rebuttal, save the look she gave me earlier when she grabbed my arm back on the street, the look of mental writer's block. I was a little more stern with her after exposing her false intentions, and told her that if she had to grab something, she could grab it and bring it out by herself, and if it was too heavy, we would help her get it home. Side note, she lived a block from me, which she had told me previously. She was reluctant to go in by herself, but she managed to after a few minutes. She went to the backyard to go open the back door. I didn't hear a door close, so I don't believe that she even went into the building. A few minutes later, she came back panting with a light sweat and said that what she was looking for wasn't there. I asked her what it was, and she said it was something personal, but her ex must have taken it. Almost immediately after saying that, she suggested that we all just head back to the street we were on because she was tired. So we head back and start skating outside of my house like we had been. I sat down on the curb and she sat next to me. She started to thank me and said I reminded her of someone she used to hang out with when she was my age. Again, she started to get this flirtatious vibe, and my lust drew my mind away from all the odd things I'd experienced in the few hours on making her acquaintance. She then asked if I partied at all. I was a pretty straight-edge kid in school and had only been drinking for under 6 months and started getting into the party scene. So, in my mind, I was super excited to party with this super beautiful vixen and possibly even have more of a story to tell. For some reason, maybe due to the excitement of the situation, I forgot literally entirely what had gone on. I was in this tunnel vision trance all through changing and heading to her house. By this time, it was just my best friends, his friend, and myself. We walk up to her house and she turns to me and says, "Do you guys screw around with any drugs?" I awkwardly just told her that we didn't, but in a polite way, as to try and seem like I had been asked a time or two. She didn't give a response to me, aside from looking at my other 2 friends. They didn't have to say anything. She knew they weren't the type either. She went into the house, and my friend tapped on my shoulder, and he said, "Goody, I know whose house this is." And I asked him what he was talking about, and he explained to me that there was a man that lived there alone and never came out of the house aside from a very few times, and nobody knows who he is. Right as he said that, my eyes snapped to the window. I recognized the house now, and I remembered whenever I skated down that street at night, a year or so prior, it always spooked my passing that house. It had this giant window on the street side, and the light was always on. You could see this man's silhouette sitting down. It may sound super common to anyone hearing it, and it would to me too, but it was the feeling that came with it. He never moved. Ever. It was always the same. The TV was on, and you could see the hues from the television rays lightly hitting the wall of his living room, but it never touched his silhouette. It remained motionless. Always. Realizing my personal reoccurring experience with the house, that dark intuitive ball returned to my stomach. I saw the man in the window, same silhouette, same position, same television rays hitting the wall. I saw the woman walk up to the chair he was sitting in and start talking to him. What sends chills even to my fingers as I tell you this, is that I could make up who she was. I could see her face, the clothes she was wearing, I could even see the look on her face, but I couldn't make out a single detail of what he looked like. I didn't know his look from Adam. I told my friends we were leaving, and I went to turn around. And almost immediately she appeared behind me, saying, "Are y'all not coming in?" I was honest with her this time, and told her we're not comfortable with going into this house, and that we had changed our minds. Her and I did this weird psychological back and forth conversation, me being too polite to just flat out reject, and her cunningly but subtly trying to sway us into going into her home. Her eyes, by this time, had that same look to match when she had grabbed me earlier, a biting look. I finally just ripped the mulberry bush out and told her that we were going home, and that we weren't comfortable. Her demeanor completely flipped, and she said she understood and that it was nice meeting us. She was so abrupt that I was relieved but still tense all the way until we reached my bedroom. I didn't get very much sleep at all due to my paranoid state. The next day brought on a new confidence, and I decided to get my best friend and go talk to the man that lived there. When I arrived to my friend's house, he declined my invitation. He was acting really strange and looked worse than I did trying to sleep the night before. He told me to go ask his mom to go with me. I thought that was super strange, but I was pretty close with her, so I asked. She told me that the man that lived there died 2 months before and that nobody lives there. She said the man was handicapped and that he was a really nice man. She hadn't known much of him past a rare few occasions, but he was sweet when she had met him those few times. That night, I was terrified sick, but I had to know what the night before was all about. So I skateboarded down that street and past the house. No lights, no television hues, no man. Since then, I've never witnessed a light on. Nobody has ever went in or out of that house, and I've never seen that woman again, and I never hope to. A few friends and I contemplated breaking into the house over a few drinks, but we never wound up following through. This happened about 14 years ago. My boyfriend and I went to a graveyard one night because he had told me a story about how he had seen something there. He didn't really want to take me, but I insisted. He said that he had heard stories about the place, and if you go there and sit every night, you'd eventually see it. He said he had finally seen the thing himself on the 3rd or 4th consecutive night that he visited, and that it was man-like and gray, but he'd only caught a glimpse of it and never went back afterward. I remember him saying he had car trouble when it appeared also. Well, I couldn't resist. I wanted to see it for myself. On the 3rd night, we saw it. We were sitting in the dark with the moon being the only source of light. Man, we were dumb, and we both suddenly got creeped out for the first time since we had been visiting this place. We changed our minds about the whole thing and decided to leave and never come back. But, lo and behold, the car, my car that has never had any trouble before, and not again for years after this incident, wouldn't start. My boyfriend was driving that night and kept trying, and it eventually did start up. When the headlights came on full force, we saw it standing right in front of the car. It was about 7 foot tall, and it was gray. In fact, it looked like a moving statue to me. It was kind of bent over, just looking into the windshield at us, and we were freaking the hell out. Finally, it kind of shifted, and the car started. The thing darted off to the left so quick, I knew that if it came to the side windows, we would both be dead within a minute. It was so fast. But it just stood to the side of the car watching us as we drove away. The cemetery was laid out where the gravel road, old country cemetery, went around the whole graveyard in a circle and looped back around, so the entrance is also the exit. We were spinning tires and slinging gravel the whole way around, but when we passed the place where the thing was, it hadn't moved. It had been standing there watching us go around the gravel circle, and it let us leave, but it was looking directly at me. The passenger side of the car was facing it. And I really couldn't make out any of the features because it was dark, but I was overcome with the most severe depression that I've ever felt in my life at that moment when I was looking back at this thing. It was like everyone and everything I cared about in my whole life was burned right before my eyes. The pain and hurt was almost tangible, and it took my breath away in that moment. That night, when I was home and finally able to somehow sleep, I had a dream that the thing was calling to me from the graveyard, begging for me to come back. It was harmless and miserable and stuck in that old cemetery forever, and it was alone, so alone. When I woke up, I was determined to go back to find the creature. But before I could even tell my boyfriend, I got calls from him and 2 of my best friends. All 3 of them had nightmares where the things had brutally murdered and mutilated me. The 2 girls who called me didn't know anything about the graveyard incident the night before. It was so late when I got back home, I didn't tell anyone about it, and just went to bed. My boyfriend dreamt that I had gone back to the place because I felt bad for it, so he drove out there after me. When he got there, he found the thing ripping me apart, tearing me open. For a long time, I had dreams about it saying,
"I won't hurt you, please come back and help me.
I'm suffering." And for a while, I had to fight the urge to go back even after 3 people told me about their nightmares where I died. The pull isn't strong at all anymore. I guess it faded with time and kids and adulting, but I do think about it often, and I do kind of get a little itch to just drive through and, I don't know. It'd be dumb as hell, but there's always been a little nagging voice that whispers about the things we saw that night. It had a masculine physique, but no genitalia, and its eyes were completely black. No irises or pupils or anything. Just black, inky nothingness. I've been searching all these years, but the only pics I've seen that look even remotely like it are Wendigos. but not the ones with fur or antlers. Just grayish humanoid sexless thing. The best way I could describe it actually is, it just looked like a statue to me. Does anyone have any idea what this might be? It's bugged me for damn near 2 decades, and any suggestions would be appreciated. Port Orford, Oregon, around 10 p.m. Saturday, December 21st, 2019. I was in bed when I heard knocking on a tree again. It sounded very close, so this time I turned off the TV completely and clapped whenever there was a knocking. The window was open, so whoever or whatever it was could hear me clearly. It stopped and then knocked twice, so I clapped my hands twice. We continued to do this for a few minutes until I decided to make it more complex. 3 claps with the pause, and then 2 claps, for example. The knocking repeated the beats that I was clapping each time. I started to get spooked, so I stopped. Maybe 5 minutes later, I hear something big stomping around the perimeter of my fence in the backyard. I went to the window, but I couldn't see anything. I honestly have no idea what this thing is. I know it's not a person because it's way too big, but it sounds like it walks on 2 feet. Last year, this thing made some type of call at me when I pulled into the driveway. Afterwards, it decided to scream twice at my window early in the morning. Anyone else having similar experiences? Please feel free to send me a message. A couple years ago when I was a child, I've had around a dozen encounters with what I call little people. But I can only remember 3 of them vividly, because most of the encounters were really just me catching a glimpse of the little suckers running through something, then me running after it only for it to disappear behind a wall or some furniture. If I remember correctly, my first encounter was when I was around 9 years old and I was in my room upstairs drawing something. But I decided to go downstairs to get something, and that's when I saw it. A small, dark, humanoid figure, only standing around 2 feet tall. It was humanoid, but not quite human. Its skin was a dark gray, its limbs were very skinny and slightly longer than they should have been, and it had a disproportionately large head. It was difficult to make out any other features because it was full on sprinting toward the stairs, but since this was the first time I was witnessing something this bizarre, everything seemed to slow down. So it was a running blur of gray, but I was eventually able to make out some of the key features from some other experiences. The weirdest part is that I didn't really get a bad sense of malice from it, as one would expect to get from something this freaky. So instead of screaming or running away, I ran after it, but it disappeared when it got out of view. The 2 other encounters were pretty similar to this. I noticed that it always occurred at the top of the stairs. I had a couple other strange experiences which were less friendly, and one that crossed the line for me. That's a story for another time, but to summarize, when I was around 11, something spoke to me when I was home alone, and that was the only time in my life where I actually feared for my life. So I sprinted out of my apartment and stayed outside until my mom came home, and I wasn't able to sleep for months due to constant noise at night. I'm getting off topic. I just want to know if anyone has had similar experiences, or if someone has answers as to what the hell these things are. Because the only thing I know is that apparently this isn't the first time things like this had happened. My father and aunts have also had experiences with odd, dark entities when they were children, and even adults too. If I ever see these things again, I'll try to snap a pic, but if I can't do that in time, then I'll make an illustration of what they look like. Back when I was about 3 or 4 years old, I lived and still live in the same apartment. Whenever I would walk down the hallway to my bathroom or my mom's bedroom, I would see strange figures in the dark. Not just shadows, but physical beings that I was able to touch. When I turned 6 years old, I didn't see the figures as often as I used to, but one night while I was walking down to the bathroom, I was tripped by one of the figures. It didn't just stick its foot out in front of me or anything like that. Instead, it came up through the floor and grabbed me by my ankles. I fell and hit my head on the kitchen bar to my right and got knocked out. When I woke back up, I saw another figure in front of me, and I immediately covered my face because, as a 6-year-old, I still thought that it made the figures ignore me. But instead of it just going past me, it picked me up and put me back on my feet. To this day, I still don't know why the figure helped me, but I do know that not all the figures were good. Now I don't ever go down that hallway without the lights on, even during the day. I'm new to making posts, so if this trails off, that's why. I live in St. Paul, Minnesota, and apparently there are tall black creatures that walk along the river on the east side of St. Paul. I don't expect you to know where these places are. I've never experienced or seen these myself, mainly because I haven't tried to seek them out yet. I plan on doing that in the summer. It's winter right now. Anyways, I have old-timer friends that say it is real and that they have seen them with their own eyes. I'm pretty skeptical about all this, but they say it's a tall, black creature, roughly as big as a 2-story house. When they get spotted by these things, they run off. Apparently they're shy and don't like confrontation. My grandma has an old friend that lives by the river, and during the summer nights they always walk past her home. My grandma's friend is pretty used to them, but her daughter isn't. My grandma's friend offered my grandma to stay and see them, but she was too scared to see them, and I don't blame her. To be honest, I don't know why she hasn't recorded them. I tried to do quote-unquote research, but I can't find anything on these things. Anyways, the main reason why I think this might be true is because of a friend of mine. I'm currently in high school and am a senior. My sophomore year of high school, I had a one-off friend that I only talked to during that semester. So one day, I'm talking about these things in class, and he blurts out, "I thought I was crazy, because when I used to live in St. Paul on the east side, I would see these things every night." He was visibly flustered when he said that, because he thought he was the only one that was seeing those things. It's currently winter in Minnesota, and I'm going to make an update on this post in the summer, because I'm going to see these for myself. So, yeah. I'm going to go look for these things during the summer because that's when they're seen the most. I'm going to do it in a safe way and plan ahead. Also, I'm going to try to do it live, like on YouTube or something, just in case I do see something so you can as well. It just sucks having to wait for a full 6 months. I grew up in the Midwest US. When I was a senior in high school, I was out for a hike at a local trail in the National Forest. This was a good 20 miles out of town, way out in the sticks. It's a boxed canyon, so you can start at the rim and hike down into the canyon. It was autumn, and late afternoon when I pulled into the empty parking area, but there was plenty of light. By the time I got to the bottom of the canyon, the sun was getting pretty low. I was down in the canyon and got that feeling that something wasn't right. I started looking behind me as I walked, every few steps. I just couldn't shake this feeling. Finally, one of these backward glances, I spotted a man peeking out from behind a tree. Not far at all, maybe 100 feet. It was the weirdest thing to catch a guy watching me. He knew I'd seen him and stepped out, saying, "Sorry, I didn't want to scare you." He was an adult man. I was a scrawny 17-year-old kid. We were on the trail in a public park. There was no reason to hide. I wouldn't have been surprised or alarmed to see another hiker there, unless they were acting like a freaking weirdo. I mumbled something about getting back to my car and started to head back toward the parking area, leaving him standing there. As soon as I got out of view, I ran all the way back to the parking area, where there were no cars other than mine, which just added to the weirdness. I realize it's entirely likely that he was on foot and possibly lived near the trailhead, as there were houses out there. But it's interesting how you get that sensation that you're being watched, and it often turns out to be true. If you see someone hiking alone, try not to be a damn creep. It was April 1979. I was walking home from school with my girlfriend, and we decided to take the shortcut through the woods when I saw a dark figure standing in the window of this house. I asked my girl if she saw it too, and she said no. So the next day, I went through the woods alone, because my girlfriend was sick. So I looked for the figure in the window, but nothing was there. Then, suddenly, she popped up out of nowhere and looked up at me. I couldn't believe it. She had no face and no legs, and before she disappeared, she let out a skin-crawling scream. And then, she was gone. The next day, we took the long way home. This happened this summer in northern Ontario, Canada, near the town of Parry Sound. Me and my friend had headed up north to spend some time up at the granddad's cabin. He shares with a few other hunters and was next to a very long lake. You need to take a boat to get to the cabin. I had gone up there a few weeks prior just to wander around and help my dad with some repairs and improvements that he was making to the cabin. While I was there, I looked on a printout of a satellite map they had in the camp of the area. There was no Wi-Fi in the cabin, and it was sort of in the valley, and it was very hard to get any sort of signal. And I noticed that there was a small lake north of the one we were at, and there was a small island inside the lake. Me and my dad took the boat to the area and found a nice, pristine little island. We didn't go on it, only looked at it, and a nice lake with some swampy areas, and a small fiberglass boat the hunters used to hunt ducks in the lake sometimes, near the right of where we were. The lake was much higher than the one we came from, and it would have been impossible for us to take the boat we came in up the hill to the lake. Me and my friend headed back to explore the island. We headed up the hill and noticed that there was a small gorge that led into the lake. It used to be a river, but was blocked up by a beaver dam. Me and my friend started to walk through it, and I started to feel uneasy simply because of the increase of bugs in the gorge, and being slightly afraid of running into a beaver pissed off due to us being close to its home. Turns out that my friend was also feeling that same feeling, but he couldn't figure out why. He just felt that there was something weird about this lake. We left the gorge and made our way to the top of the hill where the lake greeted us. We overturned the boat, and after a few failed attempts of trying to launch the boat, we made it into the lake. Now, I must say, I am almost 6'4", and my friend is around 5'7", so trying to fit us into a tiny boat, plus our bags, made it a bit challenging, along with there being only one oar. We had planned on bringing two, but thought one would be good enough. We made our way to the middle of the lake, aiming for the island, with my friend rowing the boat. He had more experience rowing with one oar than I did. We both were feeling uneasy, but I just put mine off to 1, being in a small boat that could tip over if one of us sneezed, and 2, being almost an hour away from any town or hospital, so we were both kind of worried about getting hurt or stranded. But at this time, we were feeling okay, until the boat stopped moving. We were in the middle of the lake, with a small swamp in front of a rock face around 20 feet from our left, and the woods to the right. We could see the water around us moving, the wind creating a slight wave. We carefully looked below us to see if we had hit a sandbar, but we didn't see any sand beneath us, only just the dark, black waters of the lake. We put the oar in the water and didn't feel any current. We found, though, that we could move to the left and the right, but just not forward, almost like we had hit an invisible wall in a video game. We both felt the boat starting to sink down, almost like it was being sucked into the lake. My friend started to row to the right, and we made our way to the right. Then, once near the coast, we made it to the island. From far away, the island seemed to be nice and pristine. But once we got close, we saw that it seemed desolate. The trees were dead or dying, and the island was covered in stone, pine needles, and dead lichen with swamp and decay covering the lake. We tied the boat to a sturdy, although dead, pine tree, and spent some time on the island, checking it out and looking for anything of interest. After spending some time on the island and running out of bug spray, we decided to head back to the cabin. My friend took the oar and started to probe the water around the island to find a good place to portage out. Around this time, both me and him started to feel a grave sense of unease. Personally, it felt like a feeling of pure dread, sort of like the feeling you get when you get a test that you failed back, mixed with every instinct in my body saying, "Get out of here, you're gonna freaking die if you stay." We heard some commotion in the water and looked and saw, around 10 feet away from us, we saw some geese run into the water. and right where they came from, we saw what looked like a black shape scuttle and crawl beneath some rocks. Kind of like a mix of, I guess the closest thing I could think of would be of in Star Wars, when the Jawas went behind the rocks. My friend also said that he heard a strange noise, but I didn't notice it. We had also noticed too that the lake had gotten awfully still, and that the forest had fallen quiet. We found a good place to portage from, and we decided that I would row back. As we headed our way back, I looked from where we started, and saw a strange black stick-like figure standing from where we left. At this point, I didn't want to point it out, so I just kept rowing. I would row for around 7 minutes, then take a short break. But whenever we would take a break, we could hear the crunching of leaves and breaking of branches following us in the woods. I hugged the coast as we headed back. Even when staying around 12 feet away from the shore, I couldn't see the bottom of the lake. We eventually got back and put the boat back where we found it. When we tipped it over, we noticed that there were scratch marks all over the bottom of the boat that looked like something had tried to claw it. As we started to leave, we decided to take one last look at the beaver dam, where we soon noticed that there was a cave behind the dam. Upon seeing this, we decided to get the hell out of there. We made our way back to the main lake, where we used our walkie-talkie to tell my granddad to come pick us up. He was with some hunting buddies that day. And on another note, I forgot to add that we tried to walkie him on the island, but we couldn't get any signal. As we left, I looked back, and I saw that figure standing on the island. Later that night too, as me and my friend were at a fire pit next to the cabin, we started to hear strange noises coming from the woods, almost like a person trying to make the hoot sound of an owl. Although, this could have just been my granddad's hunting buddies in the cabin. But yeah, that's the gist of the story. The land itself used to be Ojibwa, and I'm wondering if anyone has any sort of guess as to what me and my friend saw. Just to sum it up real quick. Boat stopped mysteriously, sense of dread, weird black figures, weird noises similar to static or screaming on the island, and strange hooting at the cabin. I went to summer camp in a rural part of New Jersey back in the mid-1990s. The camp was situated on a long, narrow, man-made lake. One end of the lake was reserved for swimming, which we would do as a group activity every other day or so. The swimming area had one long dock stretching straight into the water and two square floating docks further out. One of the two floating docks was a bit far away, and although I had spent a few summers at this camp at the time of this incident, I had never seen anyone use that second dock. One day, our group of about a dozen 11-year-olds got the bright idea that we were going to swim out to the faraway dock. I would consider this to be a moderate challenge for even a casual swimmer. When we reached the dock, I noticed a strange-looking spider on the ladder that you had to use to climb up. It was quite large in terms of overall footprint, probably about 2 inches, around 5 centimeters, from end to end, with long skinny legs. Spiders, of course, are normal critters to encounter in nature, but this one stood out to me because of its unusual appearance. After a long swim, we took a few minutes to lie on the dock and rest in the sun. It was relaxing, and we were all having a good time. We started messing around and decided to play one of our regular games where we would all shuffle toward the center of the dock, causing it to sink. As the corner of the dock started to sink and fill with water, suddenly, hundreds of giant spiders came frantically pouring out from between the boards, swarming over and around the feet of those of us who were still standing on dry ground. This dock was theirs, apparently. We all immediately began to scream and jump into the water trying to get away, but the spiders were in the water too, and stuck to us as we swam. I vividly remember the feeling of them clinging to my wet hair, fleshy bodies, and long squirming legs hopelessly intertwined in my own strands. Adrenaline propelled us back to the main part of the swimming area, and by the time we got there, thankfully, we were spider-free. But this is a childhood trauma that still lingers with me. I had not really been afraid of spiders before, but I would say that this was a major turning point. The thought of us lying on the dock in the sun, completely oblivious to the horde that was lurking just inches beneath us, still creeps me out to this day. I just wanted to start by saying that I really enjoy this sub, so I wanted to add a little tale of my own for everyone on here to enjoy. When my cousin and I were younger, we spent a great deal of time together. We would get into all sorts of mischief, as boys do. I was staying over at my aunt and uncle's, visiting my cousin one weekend when we came across something that, at the time, we didn't think to bring up to anyone older and smarter than we were. We live in South Carolina, for what it's worth, and we were around the ages of 12 and 8, me being the older of the two. The area around my aunt and uncle's house has some small, densely wooded areas, but overall, the area isn't anything I'd consider rural. We decided to explore an area of woods across from my aunt and uncle's house, a spot we hadn't really explored much of. Not too far from the road, we came across an old house. It wasn't in bad shape, and even had a little garden with a well enough tended flower bed. Our first thought was, reasonably enough, that we'd run into someone's yard. Passing through, we noticed one of the windows to the home was broken, so we decided to peek inside. There wasn't much of anything in the house. It was devoid of furniture or anything else that would imply that someone actually lived there. Naturally, we tried the door to see if we could get in. No luck. We then heard a car pulling up to the house from the opposite side of us. My cousin and I darted for the tree line and followed some power lines into the nearby woods. A large section of the woods here had been cleared out to allow for the power lines to be where they were. So, picture a clearing of around 100 or so feet surrounded by woods on either side. After following the power lines for quite a bit, we got hit by the unmistakable smell of something dead. We kept on and noticed a wooden tower stand off the side through the woods a bit. We excitedly hurried to investigate it. On the way, we found a dead dog. That would explain the smell, and wasn't too unusual. Then we found another, and another. Surrounding the entire stand were the corpses of dead dogs. It had to be over 30 carcasses. They were all in varying states of decay. Some seemed only a few days old. Some were nothing but bones. We were alarmed, but still dumb kids and still wanted to climb to the top. So we did. And at the top, we found even more dog carcasses. So, process this. Not only were there bodies of dead dogs surrounding this tower stand, someone put forth the effort to drag them some 30 feet up a slim ladder to the top. Unsettled, we made our way back to my aunt and uncle's after that. We never mentioned it to anyone, or at least I never did. Thinking back on it, 15 years later, we definitely should have said something. I've tried looking up similar things in the area, but haven't had any luck. We never went back there after finding that horrible scene. I also wouldn't conclude that the house we found or the person that showed up there are in any way related to the tower stand. That's just how our story began. I believe I have posted this story before on one of my old accounts, of which I have lost the password for and gotten locked out of. I posted the story on Let's Not Meet, but I figured it would be more suitable for this sub, since I don't believe I was actually in danger. I also want to preface with hoping I don't sound like I'm turning my back on a stranger's kindness. However, I just want to say the whole vibe just felt off. This happened a few years ago, around 2014. I was about 19 years old, and I was dating a guy who lived in southern Illinois while I lived up north in the city. He was originally from where I grew up, but his family moved down south to be closer to his mom's parents. Usually he would come up to visit me, but on this occasion, I decided to go down to visit him and have a neat little adventure on my own. I got up to get ready and get on the train hella early, and around 9 a.m., we were off on our journey. It was a pretty empty train, but I did take notice of the man, maybe late 30s, sitting across from me in one seat back. He looked exactly like Tom Hanks in Forrest Gump. He even had the accent. It was going to be a pretty long train ride, and I was tired from being up so early that I ended up drifting off. I awoke, I don't know how long later, to a pair of hands reaching over me and draping a blanket on me. I sat up confused and looked around, and found the Forrest Gump guy staring at me and smiling. In lieu of a thank you, I just kind of settled back into my chair with the strange blanket and tried to tell myself that he was just being nice. Being a young girl alone, you're always warned to be wary of strangers. I've also always looked very young for my age, so it isn't uncommon for strangers to think that I was a little too young to be out and about on my own. Still, I wasn't expecting to interact with anyone. It was one of those conflicting, thank you for your kindness, but please go away type feelings. Regardless, I drifted off again, and I woke up this time to a pair of hands stretching over me, holding a cup of hot chocolate. This was the first time we spoke. In his Forrest Gump accent, he goes, "Here you go, it's hot chocolate. I can't drink two." He then held up the one he got for himself. This also struck me as odd because I thought, then why buy two? I simply thanked him. Another thing, as a young girl, we are taught to never accept drinks from strangers. I had no idea where this hot chocolate had even been before hovering over my asleep train corpse, so there was no way I was drinking it. I decided to just fake sip to be polite. Here's where it gets weird. Now, I might just be being paranoid, but as I started drinking the hot chocolate, this man starts staring at me. He is watching me drink this hot chocolate with the scrutiny of a food critic. I swear to you, he almost looked puzzled. In my anxiety-filled head, I'm thinking this dude is wondering why I'm not passing out. The drink is roofied, it's poison. Any scenario I could come up with in my brain, I did. After about 20 minutes of staring at me, he then gets up to come sit right next to me. He starts asking me questions. What's my name? Where do I live? Have I ever been to Southern Illinois before? Am I by myself? So, I lied. I lied through my teeth. I gave him a fake name and a fake-ass backstory. He then told me his name, which I can't remember now, and that he was getting off at the very last stop. He was going to disappear, his words, to work on a barge going up and down the Mississippi for 6 months. He also used the words off the grid. Decent serial killer job if you ask me. Luckily for me, we pulled up to my stop about 30 minutes later. I was like, well, love to stay and chat, but this is me, and I bounced. Like I said, he could have just been a very nice, albeit very socially awkward guy. He could have just seen a young girl on the train and felt like looking out for her. However, my gut felt super uneasy, and, as I said, the vibe felt super off. You never know, we might see the Forrest Gump killer in the news someday, so I did everything I could not to wake up covered in plastic on this guy's barge. Or maybe he's just out there buying nice girls hot chocolate. I was probably about 20, and I was babysitting for some decently wealthy people who happened to be good friends of mine. I was on the main floor, and there was one little boy upstairs in bed, and 4 older boys, 8 and 9, downstairs playing video games. It was probably close to 11 p.m., and there was a knock at the door. I can see it's a big guy in a red sweatshirt. I slowly crawl to the kitchen and grab the biggest knife I can find and go stand at the wall by the door where the man cannot see me, but would have to walk past me to come in. I call the homeowner because they have that Ring doorbell, and this was when it was very new and few people had it, so she can talk to the man through her phone. So she says, "I'll call you right back after I talk to him," and hangs up. Meanwhile, the guy is knocking aggressively now, and I'm praying that none of the kids hear, as I don't want them to come downstairs or upstairs and scare them. My phone rings, and she says that she talked to him, and he said he was with Uber, not popular in this area at this time, looking for Angela, which ironically happens to be the homeowner / my friend's name. But the last name was something weird. She said she told him he had the wrong address and to be on his way. However, he was still at the door. She stays on the phone with me until he walks away, which was several minutes later. We hang up as she thinks it was an honest misunderstanding. Meanwhile, I have this terrible, awful feeling in my gut, so I go to the door to watch for his headlights to leave. Their house is at the end of a dead-end road. I never saw his headlights leave, nor did I ever see a car. I laid on the couch staring at the door until daylight at 7 a.m., when I finally fell asleep, only to be awoken by the kids at 8 a.m. The whole time this big man was standing at the door, all I could think to myself was, I'm 20 years old, 100 pounds, and 5'3" and female. You have to kill him. If he comes through that door, you have to give it your everything and kill him. You have to protect these 5 little boys. You have to stab him, and don't stop. It's honestly a scary way to think, but the motherly instinct in me was telling me that I have to save these kids at all costs. Thankfully, he never came back that night, and I didn't have to test my strength. So I work in a store in the mall in a fairly nice area. I work right by the main doorway, which people come in and out of all day, and people hang out in the vestibule, area between the outside-inside doors, waiting for the bus to come. I usually work alone, at night, lock up, leave through the same area, walk to my car, and go home. 2 days ago, I ended up working a morning shift and get to leave at 4 p.m. Yay. While it's still light out. Mind you, I'm a 22-year-old, slim, blonde girl, and I usually get mistaken for 13. This day, I was wearing a pink sweatshirt and pink leggings with my hair in a ponytail, so I guess I could appear as young. Otherwise, normal day, so whatever. I'm walking toward the vestibule, and when I push open the first set of doors, I always check if there's someone behind me to see if I should hold the door open for them, because I don't want to be rude. So I see an Asian guy, tan jacket, khakis, casually walking a good distance behind me, and I don't want him to try and hurry up, so I hold the door open with my foot for him to walk through while I check my phone. He walks through the door, grabs my arm, and says, "Come with me, I know what you stole." He's grabbing my arm pretty hard, and he is pulling me, mind you. There are 2 women in the opposite side of the vestibule, and a guy standing maybe 3 feet away and I are making direct eye contact with this guy, with a please help me kind of look. The Asian guy continues to say, "Come with me," and is partway through the door to the outside, and I'm keeping resistance, trying to keep my arm close to my body and pull back. I think I mumbled something like, I don't want to. I was so confused and couldn't even comprehend what was happening. I thought for a second, is he joking? Does he think I'm someone he knows and he's messing with me? Is he mentally ill? And I pull back enough that he lets go, and then he casually walks out the door, into his car, and just drives off. Me and the dude that were standing there the whole time are just jaw-dropped looking at each other, saying, "What the hell was that?" back and forth. He thought the same thing, pretty much. He ended up walking me to my car and telling me that I needed to report it. I gave him a big hug, thanked him, and got into my car. Then I called my mom, and then security, then talked to security, and the police, spoke to a detective, the whole 9 yards. Apparently this isn't the first time a tall Asian guy was acting weird. A guy, probably the same one, apparently harasses juvenile girls at the mall frequently, and isn't even supposed to be at the mall. Security showed me pictures of an Asian guy that they suspect is him, and also caught the whole thing on camera. He apparently walked in only 15 minutes before this all happened. I'm still kind of in shock. Also, I'm putting in my 2 weeks notice on Monday. This happened many years ago. I was about 12 years old and went to the mall with my friend, same age, and her sister, 1 year younger. We were 3 typical 12-year-old girls, jeans and a t-shirt, and sneakers. It's one of those city malls that likes to think it's fancier than it is, but it also wasn't super ghetto or anything. We were at one of the back entrances, less well used than the main entrance, just goofing around by the railing that led to the doors. We were playing balance beam on the railings, taking turns standing on it and walking, when this guy comes up to us. He was maybe late 20s, Hispanic or maybe Middle Eastern. I don't really remember too clearly. Like I said, it feels like it was 1,000 years ago. He smiles at us and says to me, "Hello, I think you're so beautiful. So very beautiful. Would you like to come home with me?" And we were just like, "Ew, no, thank you." And immediately went inside the mall, where there were lots of people. We just kind of brushed it off, didn't tell our parents, didn't think much of it at the time. But sometimes I do think about it. Would it have turned out differently if I was alone? This happened about an hour ago, and I'm 99% sure that the reason it didn't go any further than it did is because of the amount of time I've spent on this sub and similar ones. Before, I think I'd have been too polite to do what I did, but I've learned from the posts on here to screw politeness. I work as a private carer, so I provide care for customers in their own homes. My job is pretty much going from my car to my customers' homes and back again, so I don't spend a lot of time on the street by myself. My manager is also quite strict about late evening calls and doesn't often let us do them for the exact reason that I am about to explain. One of my customers lives in a very large block of flats which is gated from the street. There is a large gate for cars and a pedestrian gate next to it, which requires a code to gain access. Only residents are allowed a key fob for the vehicle gate, so us carers have to park a little way up the street, which I did, and use the coded pedestrian one. The call began at 9 p.m., and I was finished by 10 p.m. I left my customer's block and walked down towards the gate to get back to my car. As I approached the gates, I noticed a man walking past wearing a beaten-up red backpack. He was already past the gates by the time I exited, but he heard the metal gates slam and turned. We locked eyes, and the moment he did, he quickly changed direction and started heading toward me. Like I said, because of this sub, I'm probably a little paranoid, but alarm bells did start sounding immediately, and I noped it straight away. I turned back around and quickly punched in the code to the gate, slamming it behind me so that it would lock. I figured if he genuinely lived there or was visiting someone, he would know the code, as you can't even visit someone without it. As I slammed the gate and turned around, he was right there on the other side of the bars. I smiled politely and asked if he was alright, to which he replied, "Yes," as if it was none of my business. I nodded and turned to walk back to my customer's flat when he asked if I was going to let him in. I said, "Do you live here?" To which he replied, "Yes." And I said, "Well, you'll know the code then." He then started spinning me some long drawn-out story that I couldn't really follow about having not lived there long and forgetting the code. I knew this was bull, because I'd clearly seen him walk merrily past the gate before seeing me. He would at least know where his flat was, and the way he turned the moment he saw me was way too suspicious. I gave him a patronizing smile, and said that I was sorry, but I couldn't let him in if he didn't know the code, and that he would have to call the building manager. He would have had the emergency number if he did, in fact, live there. He muttered something incomprehensible and turned to walk off the way he was going in the first place. I headed back to my customer's flat and called my boyfriend, who very helpfully didn't answer the phone. It being late, I didn't want to disturb my customer if I didn't have to, so I figured I'd wait a few minutes and then go back to the gate and see if he was still lurking. If he was, I would have to wait in my customer's home. Fortunately, he was long gone by the time I went back to the gate, but I walked to my car holding my keys between my fingers just in case. I spent 12 years cutting men's hair before switching careers. A big part of why I switched professions was because I was tired of dealing with creepy clients. I have quite a few stories, but this one stands out in particular. It occurred when I had just gotten my cosmetology license and started working in a cool rock and roll themed barbershop by my house at the time. The shop had opened pretty recently, so there were some very long, slow days. I helped out at the front desk and usually sat there with my manager to greet and say goodbye to the customers. One day, there was a dude who had a handlebar mustache that he curled into complete circles on each side. He was getting cut by one of the male barbers, and when he was done, he came up to the front desk to pay. He mumbled something very low while looking at me, so I said, "I'm sorry, what did you say?" He kept whispering, and I got closer. He whispered, "You have very beautiful breasts." I'm pretty sure my facial expression said it all. He tried to add, "and beautiful eyes," but I was over this dude already, and my manager had stepped away. He was just standing there smirking at me so creepily with his eyes glued to my chest. He asked me where the bathroom was, and I pointed to the back. He was in the bathroom for like 30 minutes. When he came out, he handed the receptionist a super slimy $20 bill and stated, "That's a very sexy picture you have in your bathroom." There were music posters all over the shop, including the bathroom. It was a poster of Nelly Furtado. He lingered leaving, and I got one of the male barbers to come up. The dude immediately was ready to leave and scurried out the door. There were only women at the desk when he was being peak creepy. It makes my skin crawl. This is honestly a tame story out of the many that I have, but I still couldn't believe how creepy he was. In 2018, the Saturday before Christmas, I was out on a birthday bar crawl on the Lower East Side. We were all getting a bit bored with the crowd and decided to go back to one of our friends' apartment to take a breather, listen to some music, and decide what to move on to next. Cut to me realizing that I had 10 missed calls from various members of my family. My uncle had been rushed to the hospital and didn't make it. My uncle was the youngest of my mom's siblings and was more like an older teenage brother to me than an uncle. We grew up together in a very close family. I don't think I realized how quickly grief hits when you get news like that. The sound of my father's voice cracking and straining to get the words "he didn't make it" out of his mouth was more than I could handle. I crumbled into a pile of tears right in the middle of the kitchen. In a daze, I made my way back up to Harlem, trying to pull myself together and figure out what to do. I couldn't get anyone in the city on the phone. I couldn't get myself to call anyone in my family, so I needed to suck it up and get home that night. Mission accomplished. Flight changed, bags packed with the help of my neighbor, and a couple Klonopin to get me the hell home. All of this to get to the point of this story, and I'm barely able to keep myself together as I wait on the subway platform. The change of ticket and my lack of savings wouldn't allow for a taxi ride to the airport. Just as I feel like I'm about to completely break down again, I noticed a man in lightly colored, absolutely beautiful suit. He had blonde bobbing curls on top and shortly buzzed on the side. I turned to take a bit more notice, and then I saw his face. It was strange to say, but I can't recall anything about it now. It's a blank space in very detailed memory. The only thing I can remember about his appearance was that it absolutely took my breath away. It wasn't an "OMG, this man is so sexy" kind of way. It was sheer admiration for the absolutely perfect and symmetrical face. So here we are, the only two people waiting at the stop on 145th. The man seems to be almost giddy with joy, as if he was seeing the world for the very first time. Not a crazed, forced happiness. He seemed as genuine as a child in Disney World, seeing the Magic Kingdom for the first time. When we boarded the subway, he sat mirrored to me. I was in the far left seat, and he on the opposite side of the train to the right. It was quite crowded, but I looked up at some point before the 125th stop to see that he was staring directly at me. It wasn't scary. It was as if he was waiting for me to finally notice him. All he did was look me in the eyes, nod his head in confirmation, and wink at me. It gives me chills to remember it. The comfort that washed over me felt like a warm embrace. I felt the security of a child who had scraped their knee. That feeling of mom making it all better. I was able to get myself home, head held high, and without the help of the Klonopin. I'm not a religious person. I have scuffed about God, and I've been resentful when anyone brings up their beliefs. I don't know how to explain it, but I have this deep feeling that I saw an angel that day, all alone and navigating through intense emotions. I truly feel this man was sent to give me the comfort and strength to get home. It almost feels embarrassing to type that out, but I have no other explanation. I'm a 14-year-old girl, and I have seen some strange monsters after waking up. I call them entities. And there are good entities called spirits, and bad entities called demons. And no, I can move during these visits, so it's not sleep paralysis. The first was a demon called Natasha, which was actually a ghost of a dead girl. After that, there was a spirit that I named Belle, and I saw even more spirits. But for every spirit, there was 2 demons. First, I called it a demon if I felt uneasy around them, but not only do they creep me out and scare me, they also tend to hurt me. The first demon, only demons touch me, that actually physically touched me was a girl who looked like she was right out of The Ring, that I named Tamura after the BNHA villain, who would sit on my chest and hold my arms down. Then it was a large yellow demon that I named Ghastly, after the Pokemon who would lick my face. Then it was a creature that I can only describe as completely Vanta Black venom, with a tail that I named Minoru after the perverted BNHA character, because of what he would do to me, which I won't say, but it was very bad. And the newest demon that I named Akumu, after the Japanese kanji for nightmare. I never actually saw Akumu's face. I just know that he is vaguely human-like, and that he doesn't only appear in real life, but also in my dreams. He tells me that I'm sleeping, and then murders me, causing me to wake up. But the only time he showed up in real life, he ran his hand over my belly and was about to strangle me, like he does in my dream, but he disappeared after my blinds, which had a rip in them, had sunlight shine through it, and he just decayed like something from BNHA. I know he's still around in my dreams, because not too long ago, he told me, "Even when you're awake, I'm still here." And I just haven't been okay since that. I'll keep you all updated on what happens next. Let me start off by saying this. In my whole 24 years of life, I have never been on a train. Roller coaster? Most definitely. But an actual train? No way. From the time I was little, when my grandma and mom would take me to Six Flags St. Louis in the summer, I was beyond exhausted by the time I got there, simply from the sleeplessness and night tossing and turning from pure excitement of what I got to do the next day. But I always did what every kid does between the age of 7 to 12. I had a blast at the park. Then I was asleep as soon as I hopped in the backseat of the truck when we left, not to wake up until we pulled into the driveway. Anyways, I was never scared of roller coasters, not even the ones with the loop. I was always the one leading whoever was with us down the long path of line you'd have to go through to get up to the ride, one by one and coaster after coaster. I always knew that usually about halfway through our visit, I would be too much of a chicken for a certain ride that still to this day, I've never had the balls to get on. The goddamn train that takes you around the park. That's right, the damn choo-choo train. Why? I cannot tell you for the life of me a single reason, or even possibly as to why the hell I am so terrified of trains. Now fast forward around a decade to the time, and I'm 20 years old. I live in a small town in southeast Missouri, and my mom lives in the house right next door. Every so often, I'd go next door and watch TV with her and my baby sister if I got bored. She also finally came to terms with the fact that I smoke weed, and when my sister is visiting my grandparents across town, I'll sometimes go and share it with my mom. But this time in particular, it was all three of us. I'm laying on the couch, my sister is at her princess table in the corner playing with something, and my mom just came in from the kitchen with plates of taco salad that she had whipped up for us. She sits down, and I randomly had it on that show, I Used to Be Alive. If that's not the name of it, I apologize, but please do correct me if you know the show I'm talking about. About 15 minutes into it after she sits down, she says this. This reminds me of what you told me when you were about 3 years old. Thinking that she was talking to my sister, I turned my head from the TV and she was looking at me. I said, huh? She then went on to tell me that when I was 3 years old, I randomly started talking about my other family. Apparently, from what she told me and my 2 sisters, my mom, aunt, and our cat were all headed somewhere and were killed after our train crashed. At first, I was like, ha ha ha, that's hilarious, thinking she was messing with me. But then she swore to God that I had randomly said that when I was 3 years old. In that moment, something made sense that I've never in my life been able to find reasoning for. My fear of trains. Could someone help me with this? Could she be serious? I'll be 25 this year and I still think about this pretty often. Really, it freaks me out. Something weird happens in my house every day. Unopened wine bottles open, the metal door of the boiler container slams on the ground even if it was perfectly sealed, chairs falling out of the blue. We learned to live with these events because they started happening 5 months ago. I also have a 6-month-old dog that lives in the house's garden. When he was a puppy, sometimes he would start crying after staring at something that just wasn't there. Now he's grown up, and he still sees something, but he doesn't cry anymore. When he sees it, he tries to get me in the house and barks at me if I try to go outside. He wants me to stay in the house. Then he goes where he saw the something and stays there for like 5 to 10 minutes. Then he comes back and lets me know that it's all safe and that I can go outside now. I've never seen what he does in that 10 minutes because as soon as he hears me going outside the house, he comes back to get me in. The other day, my father went outside the house and saw a bucket full of water. He used that bucket 1 hour earlier and it didn't rain, so there was no explanation for the water. He stared at that bucket for like 2 seconds and then it literally exploded in front of him. He also told me that he always has this weird feeling when he goes into the bathroom at night. He feels like someone is watching him. Only my father has this strange feeling and the weird stuff only happens in front of him. We moved into this house 9 months ago. I don't know where else to post this, so please let me know if this isn't the right spot. I just wanted to get this off my chest. I firmly believe that my best friend visited me on her birthday. In January 2011, my childhood best friend passed away. Her name was Carla, and we were super close growing up. I would often sleep over at her house. We would rent movies from the shop around the corner of her house. We sort of lost touch when I moved to a city 400 miles away, but would still communicate. After she passed away, I remember that I did not have dreams for almost 2 weeks. Then one of my closest friends told me about a dream they had with her. Carla appeared to my friend in a dream they'd never met before, and asked my friend where I was. She was looking for me. Then, like clockwork the following night, I had a dream with her in it. I was in her old neighborhood, and it was bright and sunny, and I could barely see the cars and houses. But then from around the corner, Carla comes walking toward me and she's smiling super big. She doesn't say anything, but just gives me a big hug. I don't remember what happened, but I think I woke up shortly thereafter. I forgot to mention that before the dream that night, I was watching a movie and eating in my room when my nightlight started to flicker and eventually turn off. I thought, no big deal, I'll just go get a new bulb. After I woke up from the dream, my nightlight turned on. I don't know what this means, but I felt her there. Fast forward to this year, I read recently about how lost loved ones tend to visit us during special times like birthdays or anniversaries of their death. We just have to see it, I guess. So I started talking to Carla more often than normal and thanking her for everything she'd done for me, since her birthday was coming up, March the 3rd. On March 1st, I was in the kitchen washing dishes when I thought to grab my phone so I could listen to my podcasts. When I walked into my living room, I got a huge whiff of Carla's house. It was unmistakable. You know when certain people's homes just have that smell? Not necessarily bad, but it is a certain scent. I smelled her. I couldn't believe it. I almost cried. But I acknowledged her presence and said thank you for visiting me. On the morning of March 3rd, her birthday, around 5 a.m., my boyfriend and I got woken up to the sound of something small that fell, coming from the kitchen. He got up to investigate, thinking maybe our cats dropped something. He found out it was a little wall sign that we have in the kitchen that says, "I love you more than bacon." It's been there for almost a year. Call it a coincidence or whatever you want, but I have no doubt in my mind. I just wanted to share this. I used to live in southern Illinois with my grandma, aunt, and cousin. My aunt was a rebellious teenager and liked to explore abandoned houses, since where we lived was mainly farmland, so yeah, there were a lot of those. One night, my aunt and her friends went into the abandoned house and found a chest that had really old china in it, so they convinced my grandma to take them back to the house to retrieve the chest. Needless to say, they took my cousin and I had an uneasy feeling the entire way. When we got to the house, my aunt and her friends got out of the car and headed toward the house while my grandma, myself, and my cousin waited in the car. I kept my eyes on the house, and up in the top middle window, out of nowhere, appeared a pair of bright red eyes. My cousin started crying and hid under the floorboard. I yelled and pointed it out to my grandmother, and she yelled and called my aunt and her friends back. No one lived in that house. The stairs to that house didn't even exist anymore. I drove by that house earlier this year, and it's barely even standing anymore. All that's left is the chimney and barn, surrounded by trees. This all happened when I was about 5 years old, and I'll never forget it. Here's a little backstory on how it all started. When I was a young teen, my mom bought her first home. We renovated it a lot, tearing down walls and floors. I thought it would be a great idea to capture everything as a reminder of our first home. I never looked at the pictures after I took them. As time went on, the renovation finished and my camera was full of reno pictures, and many personal pictures too. My mom developed the pictures and I went through them afterwards. In one specific picture of a doorway covered with plastic, you can see the picture of a man's face. He looks like he's pulling the plastic over his face while screaming. You can see everything. The mouth, nose, eyes, even the head shape. I immediately told my mom, and she told me she had seen it, but she didn't want to scare me. Nothing was ever done about it, and nothing ever happened. Fast forward a few years, and I was going on a trip to Mexico with my grandmother. At this time, I was 16 years old. I remember one day my grandma told me she was going to run errands with a couple of family members. I was told to go in my aunt's car, and she would take me to the house while we waited for her to finish her errands. My aunt said there wasn't enough room in her car, and I was forced to go with my grandma. Once we got there, she asked me if I wanted to go in with her, and I said no. I was going to wait, but she insisted that I go with her, so I did. Once we walked into the building, all I saw was a man sitting in a room surrounded by chairs. We sat, and my family told him their concerns. I thought we had finished when he closed his eyes and then looked at me. He said, "I see dark spots all around you. I just walked through your home. There's a picture of a man in front of a closet." I lost it. I had never told anyone beside my mom. I was so scared. He said he was there for me, that I needed an exorcism. He drew something around me with some kind of liquid and then lit it on fire. The flame was intense and scary, but that was it, or at least all that I can remember. He gave me instructions on how to finish the exorcism at home, but I never did. After that, my life changed and horrible things happened to me. I saw, heard, and felt horrible things. I just need advice. So what should I do now? I'm 23 now. I live in Madagascar, that island on the east of Africa. A lot of people here still believe in magic, sorcery, and all that stuff, despite being a big Christian country. My dad died in 2002, and he lived and experienced a lot of things in his life. He was a Christian and didn't believe in witchcraft or magic stuff, although he experienced a very strange thing back in the 80s. My mom and an aunt did confirm that story. In 1985, before I was even born, my dad caught pneumonia and was rushed to the hospital. My mom and an aunt were there to look after him, buying medicine, etc. My uncle, that aunt's husband, knew things about black magic and traditional Malagasy witchcraft. When he once visited my dad on the 4th or 5th day in the hospital, he told me something. He gave him a piece of ginger and asked him to keep it in his hand for the next 2 days. My dad asked why, and my uncle told him that on the next 2 days an evil person who wanted to hurt him, or even worse, will come and visit him in the hospital room. And holding that piece of ginger would keep the evil person away. My dad didn't believe a single word of what he said, but Mom insisted to do it because she knew my uncle was really serious about it. So my dad kept the ginger in his hand for 2 days. The very next day, while he and my mom were in the room, someone knocked at the door. My mom opened it, and one of my dad's coworkers and friend was there with some flowers. My mom told him to enter, but the guy stayed right there, and then said that finally he wouldn't enter the room. My dad saw him, and again told him to enter, but he was standing in the threshold not moving. And then he turned back and went away quickly, without even saying goodbye. Later, when my dad was back to work, his coworker and friend was no longer working with him, and my dad never saw him again. Back when I was around 13 years old, I went to spend the night at a friend's house. We were playing basketball a few streets away with his cousin and a couple neighborhood kids. I noticed an old man walking down the road a few times. He kept circling the block. He would get to us, watch for a few minutes, then start walking around the block again. After a while, my friend's cousin left, and we were just hanging out and skateboarding. The old man got to us again and stopped. This time he said to us, "You guys are pretty crazy on those skateboards." We didn't really respond. And then he asked if we liked trampolines. My friend said yes. He asked if we wanted to go to his house because he had a trampoline. We told him that we had to get back home, and he pointed to a house down the street with a big privacy-fenced backyard and said if we changed our minds we could come over and use his trampoline. A little while later, some of the neighborhood kids came to hang out. We told them what happened, and they just stared at us for a while. Then they asked us again what house it was. We told them, to which one responded, "That guy just got out of jail for being a pedophile. Our parents told us not to go near his house." The other told us the guy didn't even have a trampoline. We snuck over to the fence and peeked over, and sure enough, no trampoline. We went back to my friend's house and told his mom what happened. Not sure if she called the cops or not. We just kinda went off and did our own thing after. We had another run-in with the old man a couple years later, but that's a whole nother story. The original poster actually added part 2 to the comments of this story, so I'm going to go ahead and read that as well. A few years later, I was staying at that same friend's house. We decided late one night to sneak out and walk around the neighborhood. We were just walking around, talking, and we got to the guy's house. We didn't think anything of it since the whole previous incident was a few years ago, and we hadn't run into the guy since then. We get near the house, and we start hearing whistling. Then we see the guy standing outside the front door. He looked at us and smiled, started patting his knees and going, "Here, kitty, kitty, kitty." My friend and I just looked at each other for a second, kind of just frozen with fear for a moment. For a second, I thought, okay, maybe this guy is just really trying to find his cat. Then he started walking toward us, still smiling, looking right at us, and repeating, "Here, kitty, kitty, kitty." We ran full speed back to his house, and we never snuck out again. We didn't tell his mom because we were young and dumb and didn't want to get in trouble for sneaking out. It was never confirmed, but some neighborhood kids a couple weeks later told us the guy was arrested again for soliciting a minor and attempted kidnapping. This was way before social media exploded, so we really didn't have a way to confirm. Okay, so this just happened this morning, and my housemates and I are still pretty freaked out, so I thought I would share. This morning at 5 a.m., I was woken up when my roommate called my name and told me quietly, "Oh my god, there's someone at the window." It was pitch black, so I assumed she was seeing a weird shadow or something, but when I turned to face the window, I could see a clear outline of a male figure through the blinds, which we kept slanted open so the sunlight wakes us up in the morning. He was standing maybe a foot away from our window and was facing directly toward us. For some context, our room is on the ground floor and has one large window that has Bundy bars. They're called this because Ted Bundy killed 2 women at an FSU sorority house after climbing through a window, and we therefore now have bars on our ground floor windows in our sorority house. Our room is also on the side of the house, so it's not like someone could have just wandered there. To get to our bedroom window, you'd have to go through a walled-off patio section and a thicket of vines and foliage, so you'd have to put some work into walking up there, which makes me think whatever this guy was doing was very deliberate and planned. I froze, and I didn't know what to do. It was too dark to take a picture or make out details that could identify the person, so I just kinda sat in my bed trying to process what was going on. It seemed that he was looking through the window into our room, but after a few seconds of watching him, my roommate and I noticed he was holding a flashlight. To me, it looked like he was holding on the Bundy bars, and where they meet the wall to see how secure they were. The bars can only be opened from the inside. And, coincidentally, we just replaced them last semester. I am really not sure which possibility is scarier. After a few minutes, the guy just went away. We told our house mom immediately, and she called the police. Our house has security cameras at every entrance, and apparently they caught footage of him pacing back and forth. So, he was there for a while. I'm still pretty shaken up, especially when I think about what his intentions were, and the times that this may have happened while we were asleep and just had no idea. I'm worried that he's gonna return, especially since we're in a sorority house that's home to 24 young women. The OP updated the post. Thank you all for your kind words and suggestions. All of the other girls have been notified, so our house is definitely taking precaution to keep each other safe. I went around to see everything from the outside, and saw a sizable indentation in the foliage in front of our window where someone clearly crouched or stood. It's also right in front of where the bars are bolted to the wall. So now, I definitely think they were messing with the bars trying to take them off, which, thank God, is completely impossible from the outside. So, my husband works nights and sleeps days, and I'm a stay-at-home mom, which means literally 24/7 it's me and my kids due to not living near my family. They're about 2 hours away. One weekend, I just really needed a break of sorts from my kiddos, so I decided to go for the weekend to visit my family. The day before we were going to go home, my kids had run out of snacks, so I took my then 18-month-old daughter and then 9-month-old son to Walmart to get some snacks among having a good walk around the store, you know. This Walmart is known to have panhandlers and such that hang out in the parking lot, but they don't usually follow you into the store. It's a relatively safe area, and I never had an incident like this before. My grandma had went with us, and she likes usually to push the cart. So that means I was walking along sort of free of kids and accidentally bumped into a woman. I stopped and apologized, and I asked if she was all right. She was. She asked the same, and I was too. We then smiled at each other and walked our separate ways. I was still smiling as I was walking over toward my grandma and babies and noticed a man standing off the side kind of staring at me. Imagine a super skinny dude with a shaggy haircut and a goatee that looked kind of greasy. Not like a homeless guy, but like someone who hasn't showered in a good 3 days. I didn't think anything of it at first, and thought, sometimes people look around and wind up inadvertently looking at you. No big deal. My family and I continued on down a few more aisles when my grandma tried to discreetly motion for me to look behind her. Me, having no tact whatsoever, asked what's up hella loud. She then whispered, "That guy is following you." I, at first, had no idea what she was talking about, but I looked up, and there he was. I got kind of creeped out feeling, but not to scare her or my kids, I said, "Maybe he just needs something from this aisle. It's fine." Just to be safe, I put myself between them and the man, and I ushered them off to another random aisle far away from that one. He wasn't there right at first, which made me feel a bit better, like maybe I was being creeped out for no reason. So I just started to go about my business. I'm looking at random items in this aisle, household cleaners and such, and out of the corner of my eye, movement catches my attention. I look up, and at the end of the aisle, there he is, peeking around an end cap like he was trying to hide. He was literally just sticking the top of his head past the end cap, so all I could see were his eyes. I look at him and make eye contact. He then backs away from the end cap so I can see him, and he's smiling at me. It wasn't like a, "Hi again, nice to see you" smile. It was a crazy, "I'm gonna put you in my murder van" kind of smile. He's standing at the end of the aisle now and staring me down with his creepy-ass smile, and I'm staring right back like a deer in the headlights. And then I do something that was probably very stupid. I turned my back on him and began to move my grandma and kids along to somewhere else. As we exit the aisle into the walkway, I ask my grandma if we should leave. She says no because who knows if he has someone waiting to help him in the parking lot. We start to wander to the front of the store since there's usually a lot of people up there. My anxiety was beginning to kick in hard, and I look up and there he is standing in the path we would have to take to get to the front. So, obviously, we turn and start to go back the opposite direction from him. At this point, we're basically running and make it to another aisle. At this point, we start trying to make a plan of what exactly we're going to do, and as we're doing this, unbeknownst to us, a security guard was nearby and overheard. Let's just call him SG for short. SG approaches us and asked if we were okay. My grandma began explaining the situation, and as she's doing so, I look up, and there he is again at the end of the aisle. I motion for my grandma to look. Both grandma and SG look over, and they see him. When he realized we were telling security about him, he waved at me and then took off to the front of the store with SG following. We wait a few moments, and then follow to see this man walk through a closed check stand, still being followed by SG, and out the door. We then decided to wait a while before leaving because, like Grandma had said, we didn't know if he had anyone waiting for him in the parking lot, but didn't want to take the risk of bumping into him again. Then after about 30 minutes, we made our purchases, and we left. He, thank freaking God, was not waiting in the parking lot. Let me start off this next story by saying that it's going to sound kind of familiar to those of you that have been around my channel for a couple months. I've actually read this story before, but the story that I plan to use for this video is a follow-up to this one, so I kind of wanted to read the original one first and then do the follow-up because it works better that way. That way I'm not reading a follow-up story and then you don't know what happened originally and it doesn't make as much sense. So, alright, here's we go. Back when I was either 6 or 7 years old, I had a nightmare. A nightmare that changed everything. One night I stayed up with my father watching alien movies, and stuff was getting too real for me, so I went to sleep. A few hours later, I woke up due to a horrible dream I had had. I called out for help, but no one came. Even the ones I shared a room with didn't wake up. I gave in and decided to go to my parents' room. I got out of the bed, turned on the lights, and then I quickly ran across into my parents' room. Mom? Dad? No response. I got on the bed and tried waking my mom up. She didn't wake up. I tried my dad, and fortunately, he did wake up. We tried to wake my mom, only to discover that she had passed out. We called for help and then went to check on my sister and the housekeeper. They were both unresponsive. Help arrived, the neighbors, and the watchman. Well, later on, my father discovered that the housekeeper had forgotten to remove the charcoal grill, and it had led to the poisoning of the air due to the carbon monoxide. That's why everyone was passed out and unresponsive. I'm kinda glad I stayed up and watched that movie with him. Otherwise, I would have probably had a peaceful night and woken up to a house full of dead people. That's the original, here's the follow-up. So on the 4th of February, my friend came to my place for a sleepover. We decided to make burgers together. He was quite new to cooking, so I challenged him to saute the patties as I prepared the buns, tomatoes, and onions. When we finished, we went to the living room to eat and binge-watched some series called The Stranger. We both had class at 7 a.m., so we decided to go to sleep early. I remember as I was sleeping, I had a nightmare, and in my nightmare I somehow had a way of figuring out how I would die. And when the moment would come, I didn't die. Then I'd figure out another way, and it got to a point that I just woke up, and I decided to recite the Lord's Prayer. I drifted off to sleep, and my alarm woke me up at 6:30 a.m. I was too tired to go to school. I decided to continue sleeping, and woke up at 11:40. I went to the kitchen to make some coffee, and that is whenever I noticed that we had once again slept with the gas on. This guy hadn't turned off the cooker. So that add-on there was just, like I said, a quick follow-up from 2 months ago. People, if you have anything that's a gas equipment, make sure it's off whenever you're done using it, please. As an FYI, this is my first post, so please forgive me. Also, I'm not entirely sure if this is the right place to post this story, so please let me know. For context, this happened a while back. I believe I may have been either 16 or 17 years old when this story took place. I just recently turned 20, and I'd also like to note that I was, and still am, a small woman. At the time this took place, I was probably about 5 foot 2 inches and 82 pounds. Being as small as I am, I'm a fairly paranoid person, so maybe to some this won't seem like that odd of an encounter. Anyway, on to the story. I was walking around Walmart with my best friend Catherine, just killing time, when I noticed that one of the workers, an older man, was watching me as we browsed the aisles. If I had to take a guess, I would say that he was in his late 40s or early 50s. He never approached me, so I didn't think much of it. Maybe he mistook me for someone he knew. Eventually, after a while, we grew bored and decided to leave. She dropped me off back at my house, and then she went home. Just as I had crawled into the bed for the night, I received a notification on my phone. It was a friend request on Facebook. I didn't recognize the name, so I opened it. I was shocked to see that it was the Walmart worker. The weird part is, I don't recall either of us saying my name while we were in that store. Even if I had said my first name, I certainly did not mention my last name. I wish I would have taken a picture of it before I deleted the request, but I didn't. He never sent another one, and he didn't message me. For that, I'm glad. But every time I would go into the store, he would notice me, and he would just watch me. It felt like he was following me around the store. A year or so back, I had gone into Walmart with my boyfriend. We were killing time before a date. The movie wasn't starting for another hour or so. I was in a fairly nice dress and heels. I received a few odd glances, but those didn't bother me. What did bother me, though, was the man. The moment my boyfriend left my side to use the bathroom, he got closer to me. I had been sitting on one of those benches right outside the bathroom. There was a door beside the one that I was sitting on. Not sure what it was for. But just moments after I sat down, the worker walked over to the door, maintaining painfully long eye contact with me as he passed through the door. Lately, I have not seen him on any of my shopping trips, and I hope it stays that way. This did not happen to me, but I live in the area where it did take place. As far as I know, this is not a made-up story. My friends and I were discussing the scary things we had seen in the woods, and he told me a story that happened to his friend. So this guy was with 5 of his friends, and they were spending a few days in a cabin hunting and trapping. They were not drunk, but had had a few beers to unwind one night. So one of them goes out to the outhouse to go to the bathroom, and he swears that off into the woods, he hears the faint sound of a drum beating. So he finishes in the outhouse and goes into the cabin to tell his friends to come out and check this sound. So they all grab their rifles and walk out to the ridge their cabin was on, and down the hollow behind it, and back up the other side. It was a pretty rocky area, so the sound traveled far. And they could tell that just over the hill was where the sound was coming from. So the 5 of them spread out about 50 feet apart and walk up to the top. They couldn't see down over because of all the laurel bushes around, so the 5 of them wait, and one of them sneaked down through to see what it was. When he got there, he stood and watched for about 30 seconds to a minute before he turned around and went to his friends as fast as he could, telling them he saw evil and that they had to get the hell out of there right then. All he would tell them was he saw a bunch of naked men and women dancing around in a circle, chanting something in a foreign language. He never told them about everything he saw. The guy who told my friend this story was one of the guys who hung back and didn't see what happened. I'm not the best storyteller, so please bear with me. I was born and raised in Charlotte, North Carolina, and still live on the east side. There is a public park near my parents' house called McAlpine Creek, which is mainly a large cross-country trail stretching miles across East Charlotte. The park is enveloped by hundreds of acres of dense forest and undeveloped land that is discreetly amidst busy streets and highways. Yet, you almost don't realize how big the forest stretches because of the infrastructure around it. There is a myth/folk tale about a devil church or Satan church deep within the park. There are a few videos on YouTube and other forum posts around the web of locals attempting to approach it. A simple Google search and you'll find them. In my senior year of high school, scouring the internet about this supposed church, I had somehow found a somewhat vague description of the location from someone who had attempted to go down the roads deep within the park to find it. My girlfriend at the time and I, one Friday night, decided to try and find the roads that lead to the church. We drove down the winding roads behind a Carmax that borders the dense woods of the park, where there is a small neighborhood of sorts. I think I had gotten 2 street names that were in close proximity to the spot. Cautiously driving down these quiet and dark roads, we had found a seemingly abandoned dirt track, offshooting from the paved road. Keep in mind, there are almost no streetlights anywhere. While driving for about 2 or 3 minutes, there had been a pickup truck in front of us maybe 50 feet or so. Upon seeing the dirt track and our interest piqued, we stopped the car to discuss what we wanted to do. We began to slowly pull onto the dirt track, and simultaneously the pickup truck ahead of us abruptly stopped and sat in place. We noticed this, having fully pulled into the dirt road at this point, and immediately stopped and stood frozen in panic. The driver of the truck quickly put his or her car in reverse. We could see the reverse lights turn on, and began to immediately back up toward us. I threw my car in reverse in panic, and attempted to turn back the way we had come. I was able to get turned around and back into drive fairly quickly. In reverse, the driver of the truck was accelerating very quickly toward us. I floored the gas of my Nissan Altima. The truck followed us for a few seconds, and then stopped. We never looked back. We never found the supposed church, but this happening scared the hell out of us, and I've never considered attempting to go back. Growing up, I had a childhood friend that lived relatively close by, and we were like 2 peas in a pod. We both were adventurous, believed in the paranormal, enjoyed astronomy, and generally just being outside. She was born in Alaska, and her dad lived there for quite a while, so they were always into camping, hiking, fishing, skiing, you name it. It was with my friend's family that I got introduced to fishing and did a lot of camping. This happened during the mid to late 90s, and we were maybe around 10 to 12 years old. It's been a while, so I can't remember exactly. One camping trip, we went to this lake in the forest that was surrounded by a meadow, and feeding the lake was a small stream leading out of the woods. Anyway, we played in the meadow and the stream all day while my friend's dad fished. The lake wasn't very big, and because it had a meadow all around it, he could keep an eye on our whereabouts while he fished. While messing around by the stream, the wooded area it was coming from gave me weird vibes. I can't explain it really, I just felt uneasy. Anyway, the day faded away into early evening, and it was time to leave and find a camping spot. My friend's dad picked up his fishing gear, and we all walked back to the truck on this long, winding path through the woods. Once in the truck, we dropped into a more remote area of that forest and made our way up this steep road that was so rough and at such an incline that I was convinced that my friend's dad was going to break his truck. He had a 4, maybe 6-cylinder Toyota pickup that was about as basic as a truck could get. In fact, I'm not even sure if the truck had 4-wheel drive, but being an Alaskan outdoorsman with years of experience, I trusted him. We finally made it up to the top, which was flat and relatively open with a big area of forest in the opposite direction from the road we drove up. We pitched our tents, got everything set up, and my friend and I decided to go explore the area. We were maybe 50 yards from the tent when we heard a big crack as a tree branch snapped in the woods behind us. We got quiet and looked in that direction, but didn't see anything. Thinking it was just a deer, we brushed it off. As we were walking, we heard it again, and whispered to one another about what it could be, but we kept going. It stopped briefly, and then when we were about 200 yards from our camp, we sat on a boulder looking down the steep wooded hill overlooking the dirt road from where we had come from. Suddenly, we heard another cracking branch from behind. Whatever it was seemed to be following us. Our imaginations going wild, we came up with everything from a serial killer stalking us in the woods to deer or Bigfoot. When we got back to the campsite, we told her dad what we had heard and how it seemed to be paralleling us. He kind of played it off as a black bear and secured all the food. Later on, my friend confided in me that her dad had gotten out his pistol and would be sleeping with it that night. My friend and I were sharing one tent, and he was in his own tent not far from us, so we figured everything would be okay. I awoke sometime in the middle of the night to hearing something or someone walking outside. As I lay still listening, I could hear it quietly circling the tent. It sounded like it was walking on two legs because it had a distinct rhythm on how it walked. Whatever it was, it sounded big, as I could hear its weight, if that makes any sense, as it put each foot down and walked. I could even hear relatively quiet but deep, heavy breathing at times. As I lay there listening, I could hear it wandering to other parts of the campsite and then back to our tent, almost as if it was walking in a big, repetitive loop. This went on for who knows how long. It felt like an eternity. Terrified and unable to wake my friend, I lay there and listened until I eventually fell asleep. The next morning, I told my friend and her dad about it, but I don't know if they believed me or not. Interestingly, absolutely nothing in the camp was disturbed in any way. The ground was not very soft, and in some places was covered in grass, so there were no footprints either. This is something that I have never been able to explain, and to this day, lingers in the back of my mind when camping. I always wondered what it was that walked around our tent all night. When I lived in rural Maine, my boyfriend at the time took me on a drive in his truck. He wanted to show me something he said he had learned about from one of his college professors. We already kind of lived in the middle of nowhere, but we drove even further into literally nowhere. We were on this road that was 5 to 8 miles of just forest on both sides. No houses, no signs, no driveways, nothing. Then he pulls over near a slight break in the trees. There was a very overgrown old driveway chained off at the road with an old dilapidated sign that said private property. We parked on the road and walked in about half a mile, and there was this old abandoned log cabin house there. I don't know when it was built, but it was old enough to not have any connection to the electric grid and no electrical outlets inside. It was a bit odd, but my boyfriend said he had been there before and led me to a door in the back where we could break in. He mentioned that the last property owner said in their will that no changes could be made to the property after they died, like no agriculture or major renovations, so I guess that's why the land was never resold since nobody could do anything with it. I don't remember if we entered through the second floor somehow, or climbed upstairs once inside, but I remember being on this loft that overlooked the interior of the house with no railing. Definitely a 15-foot drop right at the edge of the loft. Maybe there weren't stairs inside at all, or a ladder? It was back in the fall of 2011 when I was a freshman in college, so it's a bit fuzzy. I remember seeing an old wood stove made of iron downstairs and a countertop, but otherwise I think the place was pretty sparse and made entirely of wood. There was also no sink in the kitchen area and no bathroom, so no plumbing either. The loft we were on had literally thousands of dead flies all over the floor. It was creepy and gross, and I know they could have gotten stuck there over the years, but the sheer number of them on every surface and not being decayed turned to dust was just so unnerving. My boyfriend for some reason decided that this was a nice place to smoke weed. I didn't want to stay, but he laid a blanket out over the flies and he sat and rolled a joint. I did take a couple hits, but started getting an uneasy feeling, so I stopped him. I'm a regular smoker, but this was just a crazy situation. Then, suddenly, I realized that the sun was setting and we were losing light fast. The house very quickly got this terrifying, impending doom feeling, and I knew that I just needed to get the hell out of that house. I expressed my concerns to my boyfriend multiple times, each time seeming more desperate to leave, but he wasn't worried and took his sweet-ass time hand-rolling himself a cigarette and taking all the unnecessary crap out of his pockets, laying them out on the blanket, and then slowly putting them away again. It was pissing me off that he wasn't taking me seriously, and I had such a sense of urgency to get out. I ended up getting out of the house first, and started hauling ass down that half-mile-long dirt driveway to get out and away. My boyfriend shuffled behind me, fumbling with things in his hands. He was practically a prepper and carried all sorts of things with him in his pockets, cargo pants, backpack, etc. at all times, like flashlights, lighters, weed pipes, rolling papers, weed, rolling tobacco, and probably 20 other things that he thought was useful. I got out of the woods when we were just losing that last light before the true darkness sets in. Mind you, this country road has no streetlights the whole way. He had a flashlight, but I didn't feel that flashlights equal safety. I felt we were being watched, and whatever it was super negative. I don't know if I overreacted, or my boyfriend was literally just doped up and clueless, but I never really trusted him after that. I don't know why the hell I let myself get into that situation, and needless to say, he's not in my life anymore. I'm not sure if this is the right place to post this, but here it goes. I went to high school in a small Minnesota town, mostly farmland intersected by wooded areas, and of course, dozens of small lakes. One side of my neighborhood was bordered by a relatively large marshland that you could access by a slope that wound down to a trail. This trail curved through the marshland into a big patch of woods about 3/4 of a mile away. In the fall/springtime, after heavy rains, fog would often settle over the marsh as it was so much lower than the surrounding area, and it truly looked like something out of a Stephen King novel. After one of these rains, my brother and I, he was probably 13 and I was 16, decided it would be a great idea to go explore the woods in the fog. Although the sun was setting fast, we knew that we could make it to the woods in about 10 minutes if we left immediately. We grabbed a couple of flashlights knowing that it would be dark by the time we got home and headed for the trail. Once we were on the trail and moving, it hit us just how thick this fog was. We had only been walking for a minute or two, but we had absolutely no visibility behind us, and 5 to 10 feet max in front of us. We continued walking for a few more minutes, BSing about hearing noises and seeing red eyes in the distance the whole time, until we came to a curve in the trail. The curve signaled that we were only about 100 yards from the entrance to the woods. At this point, there is a small lake on the left side of the trail and miles of marshland on the right. It is important to note that we have moved further and farther away from any houses. Our house was the closest to the trail, and the trail moved away from our neighborhood rather than bordering any backyards. We began walking past the lake, and then we heard a splash. Definitely larger than a fish jumping, but we had no idea what else could have made that noise. We stopped, waited, and upon hearing nothing else, continued on our way. We couldn't have been going for more than 15 seconds when we heard cracking and shuffling in the brush up ahead to our left. We stopped dead in our tracks and waited. At the end of our eyesight, which could have been maybe only about 10 feet, a figure stepped out from the brush bordering the lake. The fog was too thick to make out any details, but it must have been at least 6'4" and very broad-shouldered. As the figure made its way into the middle of the trail, my brother gasped and it stopped. Its head shot over and looked right at us, and it just stared. It felt like an eternity, but it couldn't have been more than just a few seconds. I felt true terror in that moment, and I've never replicated that feeling. I began to take a small step backwards, and suddenly the figure took off running into the marshland. Again, there are no houses or buildings or anything for miles in the direction that it ran. Suffice it to say, my brother and I sprinted back to the house faster than I have ever run in my life. I still don't know what or who I saw that day, and I hope I never do. I am a corrections officer at a county jail in northwest Alabama. I work a 12-hour night shift from 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. Most nights are calm, and not much happens from 10 p.m. to 5 a.m. And then other nights, you're moving non-stop, and police officers are constantly bringing people in. You have a lot of DUIs and junkies on the weekends, and then anything from an FTA to an occasional murder throughout the regular work week. Anyways, like I said, most nights are calm, meaning that hours feel like days, and sometimes a single shift can make you feel like you've been here for weeks. But sometimes those calm nights are not really all that calm. We have 2 holding cells in the front of the jail, used to house inmates that have recently been booked in and are waiting to see the nurse for screening before going to general population. We have another room up front that we all call the pink room, due to the walls and ceiling being painted a hot pink color, because a former sheriff thought that hot pink was a calming color. Everyone hates this room. It's basically our drunk tank, equipped with a camera for observation, and a flushable drain in the floor for any liquids that might come out of someone, if you know what I mean. One night, after lights out when everyone was asleep, I heard a loud bang in one of the holding cells, like someone was hitting or kicking the door, which would have been a normal noise if anyone would have been inside one of them. But my partner and I had moved everyone out of the 2 holding cells just a few hours ago, and no one else had come in that night. I thought it might have been the guy he was keeping in the pink room for medical observation, but when I looked over at the monitor for the camera in there, he was sound asleep on his mat on the floor. I went over to the doors of the holding cells to investigate. I lifted the heavy curtains on the window so I could see into each one, but there was no sign of anything. I figured I was just hearing things, since that noise is so commonly heard at all times of the day or night. I went back over to my desk and sat down. It was about 2:45 when I heard that noise. It was completely silent again until about 3:05. I started hearing the noise it makes when a door is unlocked from the control room. From the control room, you can unlock or open any door in the facility except for like 3 you need an actual key for. There is a door right behind the desk I sit at that leads to the kitchen and the rec yard. That was the door that sounded like it was unlocked. I radioed my partner, who was in the control room, and asked if she had unlocked the door. She said she hadn't touched the computer since I asked her to let me outside and vape like 2 hours ago. Again, I thought, it was a common noise to be heard. The silence is just playing tricks on me. But then I heard it again. Except this time, it sounded like the front door. I looked over at the monitors for the front door and saw nothing. But on the monitor for the pink room, I could see the screen starting to get fuzzy like static. Then it went completely black for a few seconds. When the camera came back on, the inmate was sleeping in the same spot, but everything he had in there with him, his cup, shoes, blanket, was scattered across the whole room. I would have heard him moving and throwing things, but it was completely quiet for those few seconds the camera was black. After that, I decided I didn't want to be alone anymore, and I went up to the control room with my partner and started telling her what was going on. After I told her about the doors unlocking and locking, and about the guy's stuff in the pink room, she just laughed and said it must have been Christine. My partner has been working here for 5 years now, and she told me that Christine was an inmate that had died in the old jail next door, and that the reason she haunts this jail is because the buildings are connected. She told me about numerous things that have happened while she was on shift, including actual sightings of the ghost that she called Christine. She said that Christine has gray hair down to her shoulders, wearing a white nightgown. She also said that Christine can be seen walking down hallways on the cameras, inside the cells with her hands on the bars looking through them, and sometimes you can see her face from the windows outside. I'll post anything else weird that happens to me on the job here at my haunted jail. I was a police officer back in the early 90s, and I have a few stories that some would consider disturbing or terrifying. I figure, however, that this story was one of my favorite to tell people, mostly because of how weird and terrifying the situation was. This isn't the story that got me to quit the force, but it is one of those stories that made me certainly second guess what I was doing. Again, this was back in the early 90s, simpler times by almost every measure. It was late in the evening, I think around 8 or 9 p.m. My partner and I were driving around some neighborhoods, just patrolling and making sure that people weren't out breaking the law. Honestly, my hometown was a pretty small one, so it wasn't like our patrolling was busy. We were pretty much just enjoying the autumn air. We had gone through the McDonald's drive-thru and gotten a late dinner, something we weren't really supposed to do, but again, it was a boring night, and we had been on for a few hours at this point. We had just pulled into the lot to start eating when the dispatcher came in over the radio. She had said that someone had just called in to report what they thought was agonized screaming, and that through their window, it looked like their neighbors had been in a physical altercation. It sounded like the husband had gotten drunk and he and his wife had been fighting, and then he had gotten physical. The location that the dispatcher mentioned was only a couple of blocks away, so my partner took the radio, told her that we would take it, and got the address confirmed. I was a little annoyed that we weren't going to be able to finish eating before it all got cold, but I understood the seriousness of the call. Abuse isn't something to just brush off, especially as a police officer. I wrapped my sandwich, dropped it back in the bag, shifted the car into reverse, and we got back on the road toward the house. I remember my partner and I talking about how we would handle it, and we decided that we would just be assertive, and most likely end up having to take the man to jail for the night so we could sober up, and talk to her about getting some help, and try to convince her to get out of the relationship. As a police officer, these situations aren't easy. You can't really tell people what to do, but you can give them suggestions. They typically never take them. Anyway, we pulled up to the front of the house and stepped out of the car. The neighbor saw that we had gotten there, and he came rushing over to us. He told us that he was the one who called us. I remember he was freaking out and telling us that he heard the wife screaming and he heard the man yelling incoherently. We asked the normal questions, whether or not he saw the man with a weapon, if he knew much about the man, if he knew he had any guns or anything like that. We got the information and thanked him for his time, then went over to the house. I lifted my hand to knock on the door, and we waited for a few moments. I leaned in toward the door and listened for anything. It was fairly quiet in the house. I couldn't hear any screaming or anyone yelling. I knocked again and announced that I was with the police, hoping that maybe that would coax him into coming out and talking to us. But again, it was silent. My partner stepped down from the doorstep and started looking at the side of the house. He motioned that he was going to go to the side and look in through the window. I nodded and gave the door a third knock. After a few moments of me just standing there, my partner came back around the corner in a rush. He tells me that he saw someone on the floor through the window and that we needed to get in there right away. I nodded, grabbed my radio, and told dispatch that we were going to attempt to enter the property. Once they confirmed and mentioned they were sending backup our way, we drew our weapons and mentally prepared for what was going to be inside that house. I reached for the doorknob and turned it. Much to my surprise, it was unlocked. I nodded toward my partner and pushed the door open. As I stepped in, I once again announced that we were the police, and then stated that we were entering the property. And, once again, the entire house was silent. We cleared the entrance and kept on into the house. Everything was normal until we got to one of the side rooms. I entered first and saw the man in question. He was sitting on the couch with his legs curled up. He was rocking back and forth and mumbling incoherently to himself. My guess was that this was the man in the altercation, but he looked like he was on something much harder than alcohol. I paused and asked him what was going on, and then asked if he needed help. He completely ignored me and kept rocking back and forth. Because he seemed like he was tweaking, and because I could see what appeared to be blood on his shirt, I kept my weapon down but ready just in case. I stepped a bit further into the room and glanced around the corner. That's the exact moment that the weight of this situation actually hit me. I thought with the fact that the man was tweaking and the information given by the neighbor, it was going to be at best a domestic disturbance and at worst an assault and battery. Instead, we walked straight into an unexpected murder scene, and one that was completely off the wall. Off to the side of the living room was the woman's body with a number of candles that were lit and what looked like a pentagram carved into the floor around her. That was also when I noticed there was a knife sticking out of her throat, and the amount of blood that had pooled around her head. Upon seeing the state of the body, I immediately sprung into action and stepped over to the guy. I pulled him up and turned him around to put cuffs on him. Much to my surprise, he didn't resist whatsoever. He literally moved with me and put his hands behind his back and followed my every command. I told my partner to call it in and that we needed to get out of the house so as to not disturb any evidence. We got out, I threw the guy in the back of our squad car, and I was just standing there trying to piece together the situation. How the hell had an argument turned into what looked like a ritual killing? I leaned down and was just staring at the guy. His eyes were wide and he was shaking, almost like he was terrified of what had just happened. Seeing as how now was a good opportunity to ask what the hell he had been doing, I read him his rights and then immediately asked what the hell we had just walked into. He looked at me without even a blink and said, "I killed my wife." I basically stared at him with a dumbfounded look and then asked him why he killed his wife. Once again, without hesitation, he tells me, "Satan told me I had to. He said he needed a sacrifice, so I strangled her." I was quite confused by this statement, as I had clearly seen that he had stabbed her in the neck. I pressed him a little more about that, and he responded with, "Well, I needed to cut off her head to complete the sacrifice, but there was so much blood. I didn't think she would bleed if I did it after she was dead. That's why I strangled her first. I can't stand the sight of blood." This statement, and the whole situation really, was just bizarre. I slowly shut the door and turned back to stare at the house. This man that had the willingness to strangle his wife to death and then attempt to decapitate her was put off by the sight of blood? After that, I was pretty much done with him and done with thinking about the situation. I let the crime scene people do their job, explained everything to my superiors, and gave my statements and interviewed the neighbors again, basically just dotting my I's and crossing my T's. This was probably the most horrifying situation I had ever been on in the line of duty, and I don't think any of my other stories could top this one. Thankfully, we never had another murder with that level of intensity while I was on the force. I did end up quitting and moving on to something a little more desk-oriented, but that night was probably the most terrified I had ever been as a police officer. Sup, my fellow paranormal fanatics. So, this happened to me and a few other guys about 2 weeks ago. I'm a career firefighter in Southwest Florida, and we respond pretty regularly to medical alarm activations. Tonight, we were dispatched along with EMS to a medical alarm activation. Once on scene, we noted a small mobile home with no cars and no lights on. So we did our standard knock on the front door, and we can clearly hear a woman calling for help. It was clear enough to the point that we were able to narrow down the room she was in from the outside. All the doors were locked, so myself and my partner climbed through a window and searched the entire house only to find absolutely no one. The creepiest part of it is, afterwards we talked to the EMS guys who stayed outside and talked with her. They said they were talking with her until they heard us in the same room. Definitely a spine-chilling call. Any thoughts? As a little update, I did some research, and from what I gathered, the house had been unoccupied for a few months now. Also, I don't know if this is connected or not, but last night while on duty, I was in the bay, where we keep the trucks, and I was on the phone when all of the lights shut off randomly. I was the only one out there, and if someone opened a door, I would hear it, no doubt. Lights turning off didn't really freak me out all that much, but when I was walking across the bay to turn them all back on, I saw a figure standing by the ice machine out of the corner of my eye, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared to me. I don't really know what to make of all this, so any and all input or advice would be appreciated. So I was a wildland firefighter back in the day in Arizona. I worked in a forest that was generally popular with a lot of recreation in the northern portion, but I worked on the southern portion of the forest that was really remote. It barely had any roads or campgrounds, so if you wanted to recreate there, you had to work for it. The fire crew I was on had 2 duty stations, one in the small town where the rest of the forest employees worked out of, and one that was about 2.5 hours away up a really windy, mountainous road. The remote duty station had an old Forest Service ranger station and a newer double-wide trailer that was recently put in. When I worked at this place, it had no cell reception. When my crew and I weren't working, we were playing horseshoes and watching movies. They did eventually add a cell phone booster, which sadly made people play on their phones, but I digress. So, for my creepy story, I want to keep it pretty simple, but my supervisor from that crew had experienced some weird things as well working up there. There was one night he told me he was cowboy camping, sleeping outside with no tent, and he kept getting a weird, mucusy drop of liquid on his face. He kept looking around and even yelling, and no one was around him. He told me he wasn't below any trees, so he knew it wasn't tree sap. He never slept outside there ever again, which leads me to believe that he was telling the truth. Now, for my story. I have had other interesting experiences at that remote duty station, but this one was scary. It was the night of July 4th, and we weren't on a fire, so the crew was playing horseshoes and just having a good time. Everyone went to bed pretty early because we were going to have a point hike the next day. I had my own small room in the double-wide trailer, and my bed was situated next to a big window. I started dozing off, but felt awake still. And then I hear one of my coworkers outside my window asking me to come outside. I was lying on my side facing the window, and I didn't look up, but I felt their presence by the window. It felt as though something tall was looming over me from outside. They kept beckoning me, and I just said no. Pretty quickly, their voice started changing to a deeper, raspier, angrier voice. They started cursing at me, saying, "Get the hell outside." I just froze. It was sort of a demonic voice. I lay frozen, not moving while they yelled at me. Eventually, it stopped and I fell asleep. I woke up the next day and wanted to ask my coworker if he was standing outside my window, but it felt too weird. Perhaps this was a mild form of sleep paralysis, but it was still weird to me. I'm a sheriff's deputy in a fairly busy county. Along with this job comes the unfortunate familiarity with what a decomposing human body smells like. To me, it's very similar to an animal carcass, but with a much sweeter odor. Not sweet in the sense that I enjoy it, hell no. That smell normally means a bad night for me, and another gruesome memory to add to my catalog of things I would rather forget. With that out of the way, I'll get to what happened. Last night, I was patrolling a geographically isolated area of the county, which is very large and sparsely populated. Having completed the hour-long trek to the northwestern county line, I began driving through the mountains back towards civilization. About 25 miles from town, or the closest semblance thereof, I hit a straight stretch of highway through a wide valley. Since the weather was nice, I had my windows rolled down. As I passed the entrance of an old logging road, that familiar smell of sweet rot suddenly filled my car. It wasn't just a whiff, it was a cloud of it filling the cab, as if there was a week-old human corpse sitting in the front seat next to me. It was all too familiar, but this time, there was something else that I couldn't place. It lingered for a few moments, and then went away just as quickly as it had entered. Realizing what I had just smelled, my heart sank and I pulled over to the side of the road. I told myself it was just a dead animal in the ditch and that my mind was playing tricks on me. I turned my car around and slowly drove back toward the logging road. The closer I got to it, the smell became stronger, and I grew more certain that I was about to find a body. Holding on to a shred of hope that I was wrong, I parked my unit on the side of the highway just before the dirt road. I radioed to dispatch, told them my location, and that I would be out of my unit for a moment. I didn't say why, to avoid an awkward disregard on a possible body on the side of the road. I shined my flashlight in the ditch, and into the encroaching briars and weeds. As I walked closer to where I believed the source of the smell was. Once I was a few yards away from the dirt road, I saw an opening of a concrete culvert going under the highway. At this point, the smell was nearly as strong as it was when I had first passed. The opening of the culvert was about 3 feet in diameter, but large enough to hide a body inside. I cursed, held my breath, and leaned over, then shined my light inside. It was an empty tunnel, stretching the width of the highway. Somewhat relieved, I stood and looked around. It smelled as if I was standing on top of whatever was emitting that odor. I searched around the brush for a moment, but found nothing. Thinking the origin might be on the other side of the highway, I crossed to the other ditch and continued searching. As I walked away from the other side of the road, the smell grew faint. I stopped at the opposite end of the culvert and peeked inside just to double check. The odor was nearly gone at this point. I stood up and checked my surroundings when I heard a crack in the brush behind me, and the smell engulfed me and was even stronger than before. Thinking for a moment that the wind must have shifted, I froze when I realized that the air was dead still. Whether it was fear or something else, a shiver went down my spine. In the distance, I saw headlights coming down the highway. As the car came near me, the odor seemed to move away further into the bushes toward where I had heard the crack. The car stopped, and the passenger rolled down the window and asked if I was all right. I lied and told him I was. I thanked him for checking, and walked briskly to my car as they drove away. I got the hell away from there. Once I was able to get cell service, I called my friend who was patrolling the opposite side of the county. I explained what happened, trying to not let on that I was spooked. Once I was done, he paused for a moment and asked about the unusual hint of something which accompanied the smell. He asked if it was sulfur, and then I put 2 and 2 together. It was sulfur that I had smelled. I asked if he thought I had found a demon in the middle of nowhere, to which he responded with a concerned yes. A little background on this guy. He is the son of a missionary and has been all around the world. He has smelled this before and told me that it was a very concerning experience. This spooked me even more because his response was very out of character for him. I know from experience that this community is very resourceful and provides helpful feedback. So, what the hell happened? Has anyone had anything even remotely similar occur to them? There's always the chance of a very scientific explanation, and I hope that one is out there that could explain it away. If you're familiar with my previous posts, you know that I've had paranormal encounters in the past, which included an encounter with a possible possession, so I'm open to any advice or guidance. I know how to fight criminals. An evil spirit? Not so much. To answer the question that I know is coming, yes, I can go back there tonight when I go to work. If anyone wants pictures, recordings, or anything else, let me know. As an update, I just arrived back in town from that area. The smell is completely gone, and nothing occurred besides the apprehension of my returning. So I've been a career paramedic, but this happened when I had only been one for about 5 years. This has never left me to this day, and I kid you not, it happened exactly like this. I was driving home on a rural highway one rainy afternoon. It was really pouring and traffic had slowed to about 50 miles per hour. I was following 2 vehicles, and we rounded a bend in the road as a small sports car on the opposite side crossed the center line and hit the small SUV that was leading the 3 of us vehicles on my side of the road. I immediately pulled over and called 911. It was a bad one. I got out to check on everyone. There was a wailing coming from the SUV on the side of the road. That's always a good thing, because people are breathing. So I went down into the field past the ditch to check on the sports car. There were 2 young guys in that car. The force of the impact had driven the engine to where the front passenger seat should be. The passenger was still buckled, his crumpled hand grabbing the oh crap handle overhead. The entire section of car shoved into the backseat area. The back of the car had peeled away, as had the passenger's top of his head. His jawbone jutted out, raw and jagged. He was clearly deceased, but I felt for a pulse anyway, all while listening to the gasping, ragged, dragging breaths of the driver. No pulse on the passenger. I tried to figure out how to deal with the driver, but there was nothing I could do. The car had literally wrapped around him, and it would take an extraction team time to get him out. Listening to his dying breathing, I apologized out loud to him that I couldn't do any more. I told him I was sorry to leave him, but the others needed my help too. In my heart, I knew he would never make it. So I went to render aid where it was needed. In a triage, we call this black tagging, a patient who isn't going to survive. I did what I could for the family in the SUV. Emergency medical people and fire services got to the scene and took over. The entire family had injuries, but all survived. The mother had permanent brain damage and lost one of her eyes. But the whole day, those 2 guys in the red sports car stayed on my mind. That night, I was home alone and getting ready for bed with the bedside lamp on, and I heard something in the hallway. It got louder as it came closer down the dark hallway toward my open door. It was like a thump, drag, thump, drag. I absolutely froze. A broken hand curled around the frame of my doorway, and then that kid from the passenger seat was just standing there, busted up like he was in the car. I'm totally serious. He looked at me, and I can't recall the exact words of what he said, but it was something along the lines of, Hey, my friend wants you to know he understands. He wants you to know he's okay. We both are. Thanks for trying. He stood there for a few more seconds, just looking at me. And then he stepped back into the shadows, let go of the doorframe, and I listened to him drag back down the hallway into nothing. I turned on every damn light that I could. I slept with the lights on for 2 full weeks. I clipped out their death notices from the paper later that week. Turns out, they were both high school seniors, on their way home from a wrestling tournament. Their car hydroplaned from what the investigation determined. I'd never have recognized the blonde-headed kid had he come to me at his healthy, unwrecked self. It freaked me the hell out that he came to me busted up. I still have the newspaper clippings, but I'll never forget them nor the ghastly visit. Anyways, that's my experience. I've seen a lot of stuff in my 29-year career, but nothing quite that visceral before, nor since.